3 items on the agenda today. We're going to finish up with K-12 bell schedule updates, which is a continuation from our Student Achievement Committee meeting. Initial planning for the 2004-2005 enrollment plan, but first we're going to get started for the superintendent's proposed 2023-2024 budget work session. I know we received additional comments, so thanks to everybody who came in and 44 pages worth. And I will kick it up over to Mr. Nieder and Ms. Kimsey and to get us started.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you, Chairman Happy. Good afternoon, members of the board, Superintendent Moore, and everyone else present. I want to sort of recap where we've come from, where we're going today, and then next steps. So the superintendent's proposed budget was presented back in April to the board, and at your finance committee meeting, I believe just a week ago, you held your first board work session discussing the budget. At that finance committee meeting, we went through the first round of board member questions about the budget and staff responses. Also, at your last board meeting, you held a public hearing on the budget, and speakers came. In addition, we did something new this year. We took online public comment on the budget and held that open last week. And that was shared with the board, and I believe it is on the website for the public to see as well at this point, as are the board member questions. So today's your second formal budget work session. We're going to review some additional questions that have come in and staff responses. We did receive a few additional questions just yesterday. We had the opportunity to develop the response to one of them, and it's included with what we'll cover today. The other responses we will push out as soon as they're available for everyone, and they will be posted on the Wake County Public website. And then after we go through questions and staff responses, we'll turn it back to the board, and that will be your opportunity to continue to discuss the superintendent's proposed budget, potentially direct the superintendent and staff to make revisions to the budget as the board deems appropriate. And if the board is in a position to pull things together, we do have on your board agenda for tonight 2 related crises. They're both on action. The first of the 2 crises is a request for board to waive policy on fund balance, as it calls for no more than 50% of the unassigned fund balance to be used towards a future year's budget. And the amount that is currently in the proposed budget is just over that threshold. And then again, if the board by the end of the work session today is in position to make or approve the board's proposed budget with or without any changes to the superintendent's proposed budget, you will do so. And if the board requires additional information or additional discussion, I believe the superintendent has proposed that we would have a specially called meeting a week from today. There's also a student recognition meeting that same evening, and you can have additional discussion and then take action there, as the board's proposed budget does need to go to the county commissioners by May 15th. So with that, I will turn it to Ms. Kimsey to begin going through the board questions and staff responses.
The first question was asking that we verify the increases to staff salaries in 21-22 and 22-23. So in the response, you'll see a chart where we've indicated what the adjustments were in each of those 2 years for each category of employee. And then we follow with more detailed information. The second question ask about several different categories of funding. One is our position allotment for school psychologists. How many positions do we have? We currently have 120 school psychologists, which includes our Office of Early Learning. There was a question about textbook and digital resources. Is that included in the budget? It is included in the budget. Our textbook resources are allocated to us by the state. We get $32.26 per student. That is also one category that the state allows to carry over any unspent balances at the end of the year to the next year. So we typically do have some carryover. So that is included in the budget. Our annual allotment is usually around $5 million, and in addition to that, we have carryover where we have multi-year plan for spending our textbook resources. There's more information on textbooks in the budget. On page 152 shows the carryover, and page 92 shows our calculation for our annual budget. There was a question about our career and technical education program support funding and why the budget showed a slightly lower amount for next year. The career and technical education program support is also based on a state formula, and as the student membership changes from year to year, the dollar value will either increase or decrease. That formula is based on $38.33 per the number of students in grades 8 through 12. So we are showing a slight decrease for next year. There are details on that calculation on page 88 of your budget. There's a separate line on the revenue pages for career and technical education modernization and support grants. It shows an $80,000 amount from the current year going away next year. That is a competitive grant in 22-23. It was non-recurring, so we do not have it included next year in that budget. The third question asked about literacy intervention and summer reading camps and why there was no increase in those line items in the revenue pages. At the time the budget was developed, we made an assumption, like we have to on many of our state and federal programs. We assumed our funding would come in at a similar level to current year. Funding for Read to Achieve, Program Code 16, and Literacy Intervention Program 85 are state-funded allotments. So we just made estimates based on that. This summer, using ESSER 2, which is one-time federal dollars for Learning Loss 76, the district will provide opportunities to targeted students via programming to address learning loss associated with the pandemic. Intervention programming includes On the Rise and Navigating New Environments. Enrichment programming includes the WAKE Camp and North Carolina School of Science and Math Camp. And then there's a link to additional information on those programs. There's an increase, there's a question about the increase for limited English proficiency. And is that the same as English as a second language? Yes, those are the same. And the funding is based on the number of students that we have each year. So page 90 of your budget has a funding request, and it shows the detailed calculations for that change in funding. And it's based on the number of students that are eligible. The fifth question is, what is our literacy rate right now? So in the response, we have included a chart that shows, well, there's a statement that in 22-23, our rate is 64%. And then in 21-22, there's a breakdown for each of our different grades showing what the literacy rate is. The sixth question is about why there's a decrease in the Children with Disabilities Special Funds of $192,000. That particular category is for our community residential centers. Those funding requests require an application to the state each year. The application is not open for next year, and until that is approved and the specific dollar amount is received, we remove it from the budget proposal. So that amount does vary each year based on the needs of our students. There's a question about the state textbook account and why it was lower. Similar to what I discussed a minute ago, that is because our carryover will be less next year than it is this year as we spend the resources over time. So we've included screenshots of the two funding requests that show how that's happened. One second.
while Ms. Kinsey is pausing, I will point out that that pre-Great Recession, we obviously had many fewer students and fewer schools, but we received in the area of somewhere between $8 and $9 million annually in textbook funding. And that, during the Great Recession, I believe, went down to zero for several years. It has come back, but nowhere near to the pre-Great Recession levels. So just share that for some history.
So under question 8, there is a revenue code for breakfast full pay that shows an increase of $1.2 million. So the question is why that would be such an increase. When we look at child nutrition for next year, to be able to fund what we need to for expenditures compared to our revenues, we would need a price increase. Thank you. Mark Strickland and his staff will be bringing a rate increase to the board late this month. The increase needed that they will recommend is not enough to cover the difference between the revenues and expenditures expected. So Child Nutrition plans to use some of their prior year savings, which if we were in our local funds, we would call that fund balance. In an enterprise fund, there isn't a fund balance. There's different terminology used there. So the way to be able to have a balanced budget, knowing that we're going to use our prior year savings, is to overstate one of our revenues. And Child Nutrition chose to do that in breakfast full pay because it does show and is visible there. So we would not expect to collect that amount of an increase, but by not doing so, and we will have expenditures higher than revenues, we will be using prior year savings.
There also is, and I believe we mentioned this during the initial presentation of the proposed budget, a grant that we are receiving in the current year that provides some level of funding to child nutrition services, and that is coming to an end effective June 30th. So we're going to need to keep our eye on the overall program revenues because, again, an enterprise fund is required to basically break even.
We had a question in the previous meeting about how much it would cost to have a second executive leadership coach at the elementary level. We already have one in place. It would cost about $177,000 to add a second executive coach at the elementary level. That includes the matching benefits in addition to the salaries. We do plan to revise our Title II budget, which is one of our federal grants, and add the position to that grant. And if we do that, then it will not affect the local request.
And just to clarify, we have 3 are seeking to add a 4th based on the number of elementary schools.
I thought we have one at elementary.
One at elementary. So there's one at elementary, so we need a second elementary.
Yes.
So that's what I'm coming from. Okay.
Waters.
Can you clarify, does that mean that's already budgeted for and already accounted for?
It is not right now, but based on analysis, our team and our budget manager for Title II believes that we can add that position to that grant request.
Okay, all right.
But it is not.
The intent is to add it without putting it in the budget through other resources.
Okay, thank you, Chair.
And without requesting any additional local funds.
Okay, thank you.
Always good to clarify.
Yes.
Okay, and I'm going to take the last one. At your Finance Committee meeting last week, the board requested that staff bring back estimates of what it would cost to invest in our support staff and pushing the minimum hourly rate beyond the $17 per hour, which is in the superintendent's proposed budget. So if you're on page 6 of the Q&A, you'll see a little chart about a third of the way through the page. If we move the minimum to $17.25 rather than $17, there would be an additional local funding requirement of just over $2.6 million. And as you go up, we went up in 25-cent increments, and we went up all the way to the requested $18.20 per hour. And the cost at the 18-20 level, it would require just under an additional $13 million of local funding. And to clarify, assuming the state does not increase a minimum, and I believe the state's current minimum is $15 per hour that they fund, these costs would cover our locally funded employees and our state-funded employees. There would be additional costs for employees that are either grant-funded, say, for example, Title II, or are enterprise-funded. For example, biggest enterprise program would be our child nutrition service employees. And the grants and or the enterprise funds would be required to provide additional funding in addition to these figures. And so one implication, and I go back to child nutrition, will be that at the high end, if we were to go to $18.20 per hour and invest that additional, let's say almost $13 million of local funding that would be required, there would be about a $3.25 million revenue requirement for child nutrition. So if the board is desirous of going down that path, we will need to revisit if there are savings and enough savings to cover that cost, or if it's perhaps somewhere lower on the chart that the board directs the super and staff to go. And then the other implication I want to bring up, the investments in this chart do not address some additional compression. We have in the superintendent's proposed budget and in these estimates maintained a step differential. So as an employee on a specific grade, a classified employee goes from, let's say, step 5 to 6 as a year goes by, there is a step differential of 25 cents, and then there is a grade differential between the grades to address compression. There is some compression still, even with those differentials, and it was and it still will be our plan in your next budget cycle for 24-25 to look at that compression within the grades. But then above and beyond that, there becomes an issue of parity, equity, and compression between the graded classified positions and the other classified support positions that are on bands. We have administrator bands, administrators, senior administrators, directors, senior directors. And we have in our technology services area, technology services bands. So by pushing the minimum hourly rate up, it creates compression between the grades and the bands, and then that further puts pressure and or compression on school administrators and certified staff as well. So on the next page, page 7, we looked at what the average percent increase at the different hourly rate levels were for the graded positions and estimated what it would take to provide a similar locally funded increase for those other categories of employees. And again, you'll see at the high end of $18.20 an hour, and on top of the almost $13 million required to go to $18.20 for the graded positions, there'd be about another $10 or $11 million on top of that that would be required to invest to adjust for this horizontal compression. So I know there's a lot in here, and you just saw it as of yesterday. So got Dr. Mutillo up here as well, and Darren Levine, and Terrence McCotter, who worked on this as well, to answer any questions. We'll be glad to. And I just want to say two more things before I turn it back to the chair. As we've shared with you, the budget development process is fluid and uncertain because we still don't know what the state is going to legislate. And all these estimates are based upon our forecast of 3%. We know that the House proposal is higher than that for non-certified staff. I believe the House proposal is 4.25%. So there are, if the state funds at a higher level than the 3% that we forecast, there likely will be some level of savings. It will require, because it will require less local funding to go to the $17 an hour. That said, we won't know until the Senate comes out with its proposal and the conference, however they're going to approach it this year in the long session, they settle on a final budget. And the last update I'd like to share, and I believe you're aware, last night the county manager presented his proposed budget to the county commissioners, and it included a very generous increase in county appropriation to the Wake County Public School System, an increase of, I believe, $40 million, which is significant, at least in our opinion. That said, there still is a gap between the increase in the county manager's proposed budget and what was requested in the superintendent's proposed budget. But just as this board has the opportunity and the authority to direct the superintendent and staff to make changes to the superintendent's proposed budget as it then becomes the board's proposed budget, the county commissioners have that same opportunity to direct the county manager and his staff to potentially make changes to his proposed budget as it then eventually will become the county commissioner's proposed budget and final approved budget. And unlike the school board that has to wait until we see what the state does with legislation, the county, because it does have taxing authority, once the county commissioners make their final decisions, they are done. And I have in 16, 17 years never seen them not approve a final budget during the month of June. So I don't anticipate that changing. And then I'll throw one more thing out, and then Chairman Happy, I'll turn it back to you. And for the reasons of uncertainty, and I do not believe I've seen an exception to this in 16, 17 years, we do not make final recommendations to the board about salary schedule for the coming year until we know what the final state funding is, we know what the final county appropriation is, and we can reconcile any variances. And again, as I believe we shared with you at your finance committee, whenever that takes place, I think in the past budget cycle it happened relatively early, perhaps as early as August, but the year before, I don't believe the state finalized their budget until late November, maybe early December, and it was December and January when we made final salary schedule recommendations to the board. But those recommendations, whatever changes go into place, will become retroactive back to July 1, the beginning of the fiscal year, and employees will, in this case, whatever finalizes, will receive that to make them whole as if they did receive it going all the way back to July 1. And I will turn it back to you, Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Nieder and Ms. Kimsey, and thank you for pointing out that retroactive piece. I think it's always hard the way that we do our budget, and then we're dependent on so many other entities before we have our final budget. It's hard to wrap your head around, and certainly knowing that we might propose 17 and then the 17 doesn't go into place until November and then it's retroactive is always an interesting budgetary dance, but trying to make sure that our employees understand that we're waiting usually on the state is frustrating and also the best information that we can give them. Superintendent Moore?
I just want to make one additional note. So at whatever point prior to May 15th, which is when the board is required to present the board's proposed budget to the commissioners, the commissioners have scheduled a regular budget work session for themselves on May 22nd at 9 a.m. and have invited staff and any members of the board who would like to attend to that budget work session, which will really be like the final opportunity for us to talk about our needs, our priorities, for them to ask questions. They'll do a similar process to the board where once the board adopts its budget, they will send questions to their staff who will send them to us so that we can be prepared to respond at May 22nd at their budget work session, which happens a week or two prior to when they adopt their budget as commissioners.
So they have a similarly tight schedule as we do. And so the more time that we can give them to ask questions and learn, I think the better they feel secure in making their decision, whatever it may be. I mean, we all have our own personal hopes of what that may be, but whatever it may be, we can certainly give them as much time as possible. Are there questions at this time for Mr. Nieder or Ms. Kimsey or Dr. Mutillo? Mr. Haggerty and then Ms. Caulfield?
Thank you, Mr. Nieder. I appreciate the update, and especially going through those questions about staffing. The big difference between now and our last meeting is that we have seen the county manager's recommended budget. And so, and I know it's a difficult answer, but if you could just address it for us, if we don't get the amount from the county that was requested to fund the superintendent's budget, the request was $55.8 million, and the manager is, projecting $40 million. Do we know what we would cut to get down to that amount? Or if we don't know specifically, what would the process be for identifying how we would budget with the reduced amount?
Very good question, Mr. Haggerty. And at this time, we do not know specifically what we would recommend to the board. The process would look like Ms. Kimsey, Dr. Mutillo, myself, Finance Officer Ms. Posey, and others would work with the superintendent and her leadership team to put our creative problem-solving hats on, see what scrubbing we might do, and come back with a series of recommendations, perhaps even options, for what that would look like to reconcile. And back to your question, but then coming back to the uncertainty with the state, the final state decisions in their legislation will have implications, even though it's wholly separate from the county's budget, but there'll be related implications, and there may be some savings based upon the final state budget that could be used towards reconciling the potential gap between what will ultimately be in the board's proposed budget and request of the county and what would be ultimately in the final county commissioner's approved budget.
If I remember correctly, it was my second year on the board where we had to look at this, and it was very clear that we wanted to protect people in positions, but things like delaying different software implementations that we had been hoping for was something that was on the table, and raising parking rates for students, which is always a hard decision because it's not cheap to park there anyway. But those were kind of the things that we looked at, and I can tell you it's not a great process. Certainly making sure that we protect the people that we have is, I think, the highest priority, and I think that would continue to be the highest priority of this board.
And I would absolutely, from at least staff's perspective, fully support that. And I think going back to the Great Recession, when we had significant funding reductions at both the state and local levels, including, I think, a request from the county mid-year to return some of the county appropriation as they were facing significantly reduced local revenues. And you'll recall during the Great Recession, there were a lot. The credit bubble burst. There were a lot of foreclosures and a lot of property taxes unpaid, and that's the primary source of revenue for the county. But our focus then was to mitigate the impact on the classroom. And as you've heard through the budget presentation and your work sessions, about 82% of our budget, overall operating budget, is for people, staff, and benefits. Public education is a human resource intensive endeavor, and so fully support that.
Just to be clear, so if I heard you right, if there was a budget adjustment, our position would be, our priority would be to protect positions.
So let me say it this way.
Yeah.
Schools received their allotments a couple of weeks ago based on projected enrollment for next year. So they will hire based on those projected allotments. Reducing the people after the school year begins is a very big problem in the district. So, and it wouldn't even be as simple as like eliminating vacant positions, because at some point you've got the K-3 class size law and other requirements that are in place. So the allotments have gone out. So we have not, to my recollection, modified an allotment after it was pushed out, and we just have to do it this time of year because they have to be ready to hire and ready to go July 1. So we don't make changes to those. Those always have to come a year later if it has to happen. So that's not a place where you can depend on reconciling the budget. So you have to look at your non-personnel and central office. Non-personnel is utilities. That happened in 08, 09, right? Or maintenance and operations. And it's hazardous to contemplate where you would go without seeing what the state does. And I think it causes unnecessary tension and a false sense of anticipation of what you may or may not do.
And,
Thank you.
And I would also add, as I believe the board discussed at your finance committee a week ago, the topic that we've just been discussing will potentially be further exacerbated by the pending legislation for class size.
That's right.
4 and 5.
Ms. Caulfield?
Thank you for putting all this together, because I know it's an enormous amount of work. It's certainly an enormous amount to look at and try and digest. So appreciate it. And some of the stuff that we asked, you may be repeating, but in a different way. So I appreciate that so that we can understand it and fully digest it. So if I understand the whole process, if I were to summarize it in a nutshell, we are proposing this budget based off of the numbers that we have now at the moment. Is that correct? Or what they did in the past? And then we'll decide what we're asking with state and local, how that's going to affect our numbers. Is that right? Because the states kind of sounds like it's the last one to make up their mind.
Yeah.
Yes.
So what our budget is based off of what part of their base, I guess, is what I'm trying to understand.
The board's proposed budget, let me see if I can sort of tease this apart a little bit. The board's proposed budget includes our best projection or forecast of what the state will legislate. But there will be differences between what we forecast and what they finally legislate. The board's proposed budget does the same for our federal grant programs. It takes our assumptions and forecasts of what federal funding will receive and what other revenues that we will receive. We forecast, for example, what our fines and forfeitures revenue will be, which is one of the other revenue funding streams. And then finally, the board's proposed budget will include a request to the county of any desired increase in county appropriation and what it would be applied to. So those are kind of the three components. And the one component where there, I guess, is some more influence than others is in the request of the county, because it's not really a request to the state or the federal government. It's just a forecast of what we think they will do. And once they finalize their legislation, we'll have that. And so to kind of maybe go to the other side of the board's proposed budget, which is a forecast of what the state and federal government will do, and a request to the county commissioners for potential additional funding and what it would be used for. And then once the commissioners make their final decision on the amount they will fund, and once we know what the legislature will put in place as it relates to funding-related matters, and it's not just funding, because, for example, the proposed legislation for class size in 4th and 5th grade without any funding underneath it will have implications, because if we do have to add additional teachers, that will require local funding. And so on the other side of the county commissioner's final budget and the other side of the state legislation, we have to look at what are the different funding sources we now know we will have, what are the requirements, perhaps unfunded mandates that we will have to comply with, and then staff will, in fact, I guess Mr. Hackett's question that he asked, if we have more desired needs to fund and we have funding available, and or we have a requirement that we must, it's put into law that we must comply with, that we don't receive any additional funding for it, that's where we make the hard decisions and bring back recommendations to the board for different options to reconcile all that together.
So
It's complex.
today, our question is, do we support the ask of the additional $55 million in local dollars that we will present to the county, knowing full well that we will have to reconcile this whenever the state passes their budget? And that's the question before us today. Do we accept the superintendent's proposal at 55? Is there a desire to increase or decrease that? And that's the decision that we have before us today.
So at the end of that, and thank you for that clarification and that explanation, once they do all kind of finalize what their numbers are and come back and then we realize what we do have, do we then go through this process of, okay, we have to start adjusting all of our figures, or is that going to, how does that look to us then afterwards? Because this is all proposed with hypothetical numbers.
Yeah.
Once we have the numbers, what does it look like for us after that?
Okay, yeah, let me run through that, what it would look like. Likely in either finance committee meetings or work sessions or a combination of both, we would bring back initial recommendations to the board of adjustments to make, and along with recommended salary schedules, the board will have the opportunity to ask questions about those recommended adjustments. And again, it's a bit of an iterative process, as what we're going through now has been a bit of an iterative process. And the board can direct staff to go back to the drawing board. We don't like that option, or we like that, but we don't like that. And it's an iterative process. And then ultimately, the board will approve the recommended adjustments or reconciliations, and it's at that point that the board then adopts a formal budget for the year. And that, again, could be as late, I think the latest we ever did it was probably December or January, and hopefully it will be much sooner.
It's a hard process to visualize until you've gone through it. And I don't know if there's a better explanation for it. If there's one out there, great, but it's really is just a really interesting process, because you feel like you're going into it backwards, even though we're the first ones to have our budget out and ready to go.
It is extremely complex. Even before I came here and my consulting work, I've seen large, complex budgets. I've never seen anything as complex as this organization's budget, and it's because of the different funding sources and the iterative nature of it.
So one of the, I guess, the things that I'm trying to understand as I wrap all of this technical part of it together is, I mean, our programs and things that we talk about and everything is really like of a concern to me, and I'm not sure where that fits in the budget. So when you say whether we want this much money, if we're asking for less or we're asking for more, I'm not sure where things like that fit.
Like what?
Like we have the HELPS program and it's not on the budget anymore, and I understand it was a pilot. So like where do we put things like that into place, or tutoring help, or certain things like that? Like where do those programs go, or the mental health? Like I've brought up the co-health points and stuff. Like where do we put those to know is it enough? Because we said 80% of it is our salary. Mm-hmm. What about like the programs and stuff we need to help the kids in the classroom?
So the HELPS was the training, and I believe that was a combination of funding from the Y and from us. Mm-hmm. And I'm trying to recall back where we're continuing that funding. I know the program is still going. So we don't have like a base zero budget where it shows every single thing and we start from scratch. It's building on the budget we already have is what we're seeing. So the tutoring piece we're planning on continuing that. I'm looking at Mr. Cook just because that's in his, I'm seeing a head nod.
Yes, absolutely. And I think, Ms. Caulfield, the specific response is, I think the initial allocation was $870,000 out of ESSER funding, if I'm not mistaken, or is it local fund balance for this past year? In a combination of ESSER and IDEA federal dollars as well. So those are examples, those funding sources are examples of funding streams that may not appear as a line item in the budget, but we do, to answer the question more directly, absolutely plan to continue with that. And I think we're in the process right now of identifying what funding is going to be needed to expand the program to additional schools, as an example in 23-24. But I think the broader response maybe to your question is, whether it's ESSER or Title II or Title IV or DSSF, there are multiple funding streams that are funding a lot of the programs and initiatives that we have here in the district that, and don't let me talk out of turn, that may not necessarily show up as a specific line item in the budget document that you're looking at, right? I think we share how much Title II dollars we get and how many, what resources we have in Title IV and DSSF. I don't know that there's necessarily in that budget document a specific breakdown of every single line item in there. But they are critically important funding sources that we adjust and adapt every year based on what the shift in needs are. And many of them, for example, are going towards things like math resources and curriculum procurement, training for staff, staff to help support some of the literacy initiatives that we have. So I hope that answers the question, both specifically in terms of HELPS, which we absolutely plan to continue, and then more broadly, other funding sources that may not show up with specific line items in the budget document.
I'll give you a couple of additional examples. I think it's safe to assume that we continue to do something unless you see it removed in the budget.
That's right.
Or you have heard us tell you in a presentation that we're only doing it for 1 year. And it may not show up, everything that we do doesn't show up in the budget, but the overall budget that sits in academics is in the budget somewhere. So if there's an expansion and it's not in the budget, then we are using existing resources to expand it. Or other resources, like the dollars that came down from DPI specifically for math tutoring. Those dollars come from DPI. You're not going to see those in a budget. We just create a program based on the amount of funds that they give us. So you don't see everything that's line itemed in the budget, as Drew was saying.
I think it was provoked, my question, by seeing the fact that the HELPS is actually in the negative. So I was wondering, like, where does it go now?
Yeah, so, and all that means essentially is that $870,000 initial startup out of over and under is not necessarily a specific line item in the upcoming budget. And what we're doing, first of all, it probably won't cost as much now that we've gotten the program started up. And so we've got other potential federal funding sources that would allow us to continue and even expand that and other programs without having to come to the board, for example, and ask for additional local funding to support the program.
And just as a bigger answer, anything that was paid for out of like a fund balance appropriation tends to be a one-time appropriation, and it will come off in the budget, and it may be put back on when we come back to you with another fund balance appropriation for next year, or it may come out of a different source of funds.
Or a combination, that's what
Right.
the case this
That's
past
right.
year.
And if I could just add, you do have to have your budget books with you, or if you have them on your laptops. If you turn to page 53 of the document, it does line item out what Superintendent Moore is speaking to. It shows for prior year, the proposed budget and the overall change, what the fund balance appropriations are targeted for.
So I'm confused by that because there's a lot of negatives.
What that's showing is that on that particular page, the first line, beginning appropriated fund balance, is how much we're investing in the beginning budget. So current year, that's $27.9 million. Next year, we're recommending $25.2 million. After the year begins, after we start into a fiscal year, there are times that staff will ask the board to appropriate money from fund balance for something one time, which is what the superintendent was describing. So all the other things on this list were one-time fund balance appropriations for the 22-23 year. You wouldn't see any for next year yet because we haven't started the year and there wouldn't have been any one-time request yet. We're just starting out. What would we put in the budget for July 1, which is $25.2 million?
Right, and any fund balance appropriation requires board approval. Staff cannot unilaterally do that, and they generally come to the board as action items, so you can hear explicitly what the intended use is.
And what Drew is saying is the HELPS initiative could have several different funding streams behind that academic program. This doesn't mean the academic program is going away. It means that some money that went to it one time in current year is not slated to do that again.
And there may be a need at some point to, David and Terry's point, to come back with a fund balance request once those specific needs are identified and once we, for example, exhausted other available revenue streams through federal sources, for example. That may or may not be a need that we have at some point after we cross into the new fiscal year.
And that was pulled from fund balance because it was done after the budget program was done. So that's where we had the funding, and then they were able to find recurring funding through the different Title II and other funding streams, which is why you see it being removed from fund balance.
No, that answers, thank you.
Right, I saw Ms. Edmonds' hand up.
Thank you. In the comments document that y'all shared on page 5, I don't expect you to scroll to it, but because I'll just read what the person wrote. I thought it was a great question. It sounded like a staff member, and it said that they hope that removing the 300 months of employments on page 110 of the budget did not increase the number of positions that would have to be cut, such as, and they lifted up positions that are not protected, such as arts positions.
What that question is asking about is targeted enrollment. So when we roll out resources to schools every year, all of the different allotment categories are supported by a formula that's based on various different variables or identification of students and dollar values tied to it. No matter what we do or how we roll it out, when we are in the new year and the students come and they aren't coming in exactly the way that we predicted, there are times the area superintendents and human resources and others may have to make decisions that we give a school something beyond formula. We call that targeted enrollment because it is targeted for a reason for 1 year, and it's giving resources beyond what we thought. And it may need to deal with class size maximums, or we don't want a school to have to collapse tracks because how the students are assigned, or it may be a human resources issue where a staff person is going to be out longer than anticipated. We need to put someone in there. We have been managing that different ways over time. Lately, we've had about 300 months in the budget recurring as a starting point to be able to do that. And then once we have the comprehensive annual financial report later in the year, we would ask for fund balance to be reserved and appropriated for some one-time allocations. To balance this budget, we've removed any of the targeted enrollment months. So starting the year, there would be 0 in the recurring budget. We're going to treat them all as one time, as they are one time to that school for that reason. But the next year, there will be another reason to do it to another school. So we plan to handle this. In July 1, we'll look at how many targeted enrollment months were in this year's budget and how many we didn't use, because we know that will roll the fund balance. We'll go ahead and ask you for a fund balance appropriation in July for some to start the year. And then later in the summer or fall, we'll ask for another block of resources from fund balance for us to manage beyond formula allotments next year. Then we reset, and the next year we'll do the same. It will not impact.
So just the bottom line, this business case has no impact on any actual employees, and it will not impact our capacity to continue to provide resources beyond formula as needed to schools.
I would look at it as not a reduction in months and that our people are in, but a reduction in like a savings account or a account that we put aside that we used as needed, and instead we will request those funds as we need them during a couple times of the year.
So I actually thought the explanation on page 110, or your description rather, kind of helped me understand it. But I just thought it was a great question and wanted to raise it here. And then I just have 2 other questions, comments. If anybody has the bandwidth, when you all meet with the county, if we could somehow share a summary of these 44 pages of comments, because the vast majority of folks said that they supported the request and or it wasn't enough. So I just think that's an important message, and we can certainly all say that as we talk to our commissioners, but I think that's a really important point. And then finally, I was kind of disturbed, again, same 44 pages of comments. Folks don't seem to understand why we are asking commissioners, or we seem to be asking commissioners to help us fund charters, as in that's something that we support. And some people commented that they understand that it's a state mandate, but I think anything we can do better to communicate that we're not asking the county, hey, we would love to give charters, X $million. Can we have that? It's required and mandated. So if we could better articulate that for the public, I think that would be helpful.
Absolutely.
That's all I have. Thank you.
As Edmonds, in response to that, and I'll look at Ms. Luton, we could probably include something about the charters and the mandate from the state in the little multi 2-3 page document that her team is going to put together about what will become the.
And I feel like you always do classify, I know you always do classify it as a legislative, what's the term you use?
Legislative
Mandate,
impact.
but legislative impact. But I think we just need to articulate it a little bit differently.
And we can certainly share the online public input we receive with county staff and ask them to share that with their commissioners.
Thank you.
So are there any more specific questions for Mr. Nieder or Ms. Kimsey? And if not, I think our question that we have is, because we have to make this decision out there, if we support the ask of 55, if anybody is looking to raise that, please share what amount and the justification for that, or if anyone's looking to decrease it, please share the amount and your justification for that so we can hear it here.
I don't have a dollar amount. I'm just concerned that because we do say that 80% of our salary is budgeted. So I'm just concerned with the problems we face with student achievement and things like that we have enough money to put into programs, mental health. I mean, we do have a lot of funds to have counselors and psychologists and stuff like that, but programs that I would like to see in our classrooms. So that's just a concern for me. So I don't know, I don't have a dollar amount for that. I don't know what it would cost to do something like that. I just don't think we have enough of it right now for the students, aside from the staff, the salaries.
And these are always difficult, conversations. There's a whole piece that goes through each department and then goes up to chiefs, and they have to, as the superintendent is coming with her budget, and I think this is stuff that they all grapple with as well, and trying to, provide something that is an extension of what we are doing, balancing compensation with the other pieces in the multi-year funding plan. And that's what we're having to do right now.
I will say that I do think it's important to note that as we create the budget, we are laser focused on what it means for our students and how it supports their academic growth and the challenges that we've seen coming out of the pandemic. That is a piece that is in our budget priorities and how we develop what we're asking for moving forward. We know that we haven't made all the gains back from the pandemic that we wanted to. We're not back to pre-pandemic levels. But we are incredibly successful when you look at our numbers statewide in terms of where academic achievement is, 11th out of 115 counties, as well as the highest growth we've had in almost 20 years. So I think it's important to note that we're making ground up. We know there's more to do. And those priorities are reflected in how we make sure that we have a highly qualified, well-compensated individual in every building, as well as the programs that support students to be successful. We will continue to focus on those areas as we move forward. And I think based on this part of the conversation, it may be helpful to bring back to the board at the beginning of the next school year the slate of all of the things that are going on and the number of students and how we expect to implement those different kinds of programs so that you can continue to monitor how many kids are engaged, what programs are available, where that funding source is coming from, and what the impact is.
That would be wonderful.
I think that would be good.
I am, I would say, reluctantly supportive, simply because, there's a lot of unknowns right now, and I know that we need to look at things that potentially we need to cut in some fashion, and I don't want to, cut any kind of, funding to our educators or all the staff. I think that's a very, very important piece. It's just how do you slice and dice this to get it to fit into a smaller shaped container, right? So in terms of looking at the possibility of increasing increasing beyond the $17 an hour. I know that it is projected in future years that we are going to go to those next steps, correct? So I just don't know, in a year where we're trying to shift money from federal funding to trying to find local funding, that it was a wise year to do that. That's my opinion.
Anybody else? Yes, sir?
I want to thank the staff and, of course, the superintendent for the process of putting this budget together. It's a lot of work with a lot of variables and a lot of unknowns. I'll share just that I have a lot of apprehension about where we will be a few months from now when we do see what the legislative impacts will be based on what we've seen. I think, well, we can always remain positive about what the county budget will finally arrive at. Seeing a $40 million recommended increase, while very, very generous, is less than what we're already asking. And so even if the county commissioners decide to go for a higher number than what the manager's recommending, I don't have a lot of faith that they'll fund the entire request, but we can keep advocating for that because the needs are there. But I am worried about what will happen down the road. I think these legislative impact costs could be higher. But, and to Dr. Wing's point, there will need to be adjustments and cuts and things made when the revenues aren't what we want them to be. But at this point, I'm going to put my faith in the staff and the superintendent for where we are now as a good starting point. I think some problems may also have opportunities. If the state raises salaries like they're projecting and raise them, I believe they'll be higher than what we're projecting here. So while that may require, like we talked about in our last meeting, more overall costs, that would also raise that minimum. And so through state action, we can see that minimum go up. For our lowest paid employees, it just means we'll need a little more local money to address compression and some of those other issues. So I do have some apprehension about where we're going in the future, but I support the budget as presented.
It might be a good time to repeat just for the public what compression means, because they might not have watched the past to understand, but they might be tame. So I probably didn't say it loud enough, but it might be very helpful for you to explain compression for those that are listening to it, since people might be tuning in to listen to this particular meeting because it is when we're passing the budget or discussing it, but they may not have listened to what compression meant in the past. So just kind of like a definition for those listening.
Take a shot at it, and I will also turn to Dr. Matillo and Mr. Levine. But compression occurs when an employee with, let's say, 5 years of service performing a certain job, and an employee with, let's say, 6 years of service or 7 years of service performing the same job are making the same hourly rate, when there should be differentiation to recognize the years of experience.
And I'll say that a different way. Someone who comes to the job for the very first time being paid the same as someone who's been on the job 5 years or more.
And the budgets going back a few years, when we started really pushing the minimum hourly rate from, I think, the low of $11.80 went to 13, and then it went to 15. In the current year, it's 16, and the proposed budget is recommended for 17. We have addressed compression, not as much as we would have liked, but we have put in differentials between the steps and between the grades to recognize that. And to give a contrast, when the state funded its employees and moved them all to $15 minimum per hour, they did not address compression. So over time, if nothing else is done, the situation that Superintendent Moore just shared will happen, and that will create retention issues, staff morale issues, recruitment issues, and not much good.
Anyone else before we move on? Make sure if anyone has something that they want to say, because we will be having this in our board meeting at 5:30. Thank you all. I know this is not an easy decision. I know that this is heavy. I know that it is complex. And I know that everyone here has been working hard to learn this process. And just thank you for all the time that you put into it, and many thanks to staff for answering our questions and helping us better understand something that is continuing to be complex. I can't overstate that word enough.
Yes, and we still do owe the board a few more responses. I think just a handful we will as soon as we have those this week. We'll push them.
Thank you, Mr. Needham. Up next, going on to another complex issue, but not in the financial realm. Some initial planning for the 2024-2025 Wake County Public School System Student Enrollment Plan. Joining us at the table will be Susan Pulliam and Mr. Glenn Carosa. We have one new elementary school projected to open, but this is going to give us an idea of what we're potentially going to see sometime in August or September. And I know they have been busy going around the district, doing feedback meetings with families to learn more about what different families in different areas expect. So certainly appreciate the hard work and the pre-work that has gone into this. So.
Chair Mahaffey, Vice Chair Hegarty, members of the board, thank you for this opportunity to start our discussion for the 24-25 enrollment plan. It's fun with numbers in a different way. So we're here today to begin our discussion on the enrollment plan that we'll be bringing to you in 23. I think I've pulled up the wrong presentation. All right.
He shouldn't show us what all the assignments were.
This is last year.
That is a good reminder that we are so far ahead that we're actually talking about 24, 25.
Yeah.
No, we are still in the 23, 24 school year that'll be starting.
There you go.
Good to see you.
Thank you. This is what happens when you have one flash drive.
Feels like yesterday.
I feel like you can probably find a flash. I was joking that I've gone so wireless I don't have any flash drives.
I do want to say before we get started that this is complex in the fact that we're dealing with families. We're dealing with families that are attached to their school, their feeder pattern, their assignment piece, and so I just want to acknowledge that this is not an easy part because it does impact people at a different level, and so just again, thank you for doing all of this pre-work.
Absolutely. Okay, so we are here to talk about the 24-25 enrollment plan. Our goals for today are pretty straightforward. We just want to review some discussion topics related to the enrollment planning process that staff is proposing that we entered into, and then seek any feedback, thoughts, or ideas that the board may have that you'd like for us to also include before we begin to that sort of final slog into the proposal process. You will become very familiar with the slide if you aren't already. I ensure that it's in every single presentation that we do to continue to anchor us to the policy that drives this work. And so that is policy 4150. There is a particular section of that policy, section A, drawing of school attendance areas, that guides us when we're talking about creating attendance boundaries for schools and making any recommendations for adjustments to those assignment areas. As you can see, this policy guides us with 4 core pillars: student achievement, stability, proximity, and operational efficiency. And the intent is that for any assignment recommendation, we look at all 4 pillars. However, as the graphic indicates, no one has greater priority over the other. They are to be looked at as a whole and looked at case by case with each assignment recommendation. The discussion topics we want to make sure that we review from the staff perspective are to give you an update on what we're doing differently with our public engagement plan and our progress towards those goals, a quick review of where we are with the capital improvement plan as it relates to new school construction. We won't spend a lot of time talking about the renovation projects, but we'll target those new school construction projects. We want to make sure we're all fully aware of what our standing is with our current slate of CAP schools and our overcrowded schools throughout the district. Talk to you a little bit about school choice options and how we use the assignment plan to help us enhance those. and then to also talk about some of our historical assignment areas where things are changing and the dynamics of the residential, bless you, developments are changing and maybe we need to look at those differently. And then, of course, I always like to make sure we go over a timeline and next steps so that we know where we're headed with the process. So as we enter into the discussion topics, as I mentioned, we started this conversation last year when we talked about our goal for public engagement moving forward in the enrollment planning process. It is a multi-year planning process, yet we bring you 1 year at a time for approval. And so we wanted to make sure we talked with the public a little bit more about that multi-year process, the types of data that we're using to guide ourselves as we're looking at growth projections, as we're looking at enrollment changes, as we're looking at things like our magnet programs and being able to achieve our magnet themes and our magnet goals. And also the sort of somewhat topical and present conversation about operational efficiency, not only at the school building level, but at the transportation level as well. All of which are included in those pillars that we are to consider when we're looking at student assignment. So this year, for the first time in quite a while, we've been engaging in some face-to-face discussions with families. We've had some targeted conversations with small groups of families throughout the county. We started this process in March. Since you'll see in a moment, we have quite a few new schools scheduled to open over the next 2 years, and we wanted to start the conversations early, have continuous touch points with these families, and really gain some very specific feedback regionally as well as district-wide. We have a couple more to go. We actually have one this Thursday. They are we request that people pre-register for that because we are using media centers at local schools that have some seat capacity limitations. However, so far we've been able to accommodate just about everybody that's signed up to come. We also have a future school section of our website, which you may or may not visit often, but that future school section currently has some basic information about where we are in the planning process, and we're working to make that a one-stop shop for families to be able to get curated information related to the data that goes into the planning process, as well as to find next events, video recordings, frequently asked questions. We're currently building out the content for that portion of the website because we're still in the throes of going through this first round of public engagement. So you should start to see some changes to that page on or around May 15th, once we've concluded our sessions and have a lot of feedback in place. We have been using our thought exchange tool live during these sessions in a slightly different way than we've used it as a district for other planning processes, and then kept it open for about a week or so after each session, and then republished those links so that families could give us some targeted and specific feedback school by school. So because of that, we do plan to come back to you in the summer. Normally, we kind of leave you alone when it comes to the enrollment plan, but we're going to change that dynamic a little bit, and we plan to come back to you in June to give you some updates on what we gathered and what we learned through that public engagement process, as well as to make sure the public is aware of any continuing engagement opportunities throughout the summer. We will continue to engage with our families both directly, asynchronously, and synchronously over the next several months. And again, as I mentioned, we'll use that future school section of our website to continue making sure we're pushing out information to families, as well as inviting them to join us in various conversations. This is our current capital improvement plan through 2027-28. You'll notice I've gone ahead for now and kept the 22-23 and 23-24 school year columns in place, just to remind us that this is a rolling capital improvement plan. So the schools that are highlighted in orange are Barton Pond, Apex Friendship Elementary, and Herbert Akins Road Middle. Those all opened in this current school year. You'll notice that Woods Creek Elementary as a school site has opened. However, it's hosting Balcom Elementary right now while their campus is being renovated, which is why it's displayed for you in gray. So Woods Creek Elementary is expected to open as its own individual school site with its own enrollment and attendance area in the 24-25 school year. The column that really prompted me to start the public engagement process as early as we have is the column for 25-26. For the first time in quite some time, we have a significant number of schools projected to open in the same school year. Therefore, these conversations need to be drawn out a little bit longer so we can make sure we get out to each one of these families. So you'll notice that Hilltop Needmore, Rex Road, Bowling Road Elementaries, and Pleasant Plains Elementary are all scheduled to open in the 25-26 school year, along with a new high school, Felton Grove High School, and a new middle school, Parkside Middle. The Parkside Middle notation looks a little interesting, lots of extra words in that box. That's because it's also going to co-host a portion of the Wake Early College Information and Biotechnology campus. those early grades of that program. It's currently housed at the Wake Tech facility in that area, but there'll be a partnership to split the physical location of the students over time. You will see in 27-28, we have the final new school in this portion of the capital improvement plan that's been approved, which is as yet to be named Morrisville Area High School. We have not started those public engagement conversations just yet because it is a little far out, but we will start engaging that community soon. I have to note, I think, is Mark still in here? Everything is based on market volatility, and so these are the projected schedules that we're working with as of now. Nothing has shifted these schedules as of today, but I do note that we're planning for the best, that all of these will open on schedule.
And I will say, we've already seen that here
Yes.
because Rex Road was supposed to open this cycle.
Correct.
And that got pushed back due to the market volatility. So it has happened in the past. We hope it doesn't happen again, but
Correct.
always have to
We
make
will
that
plan, be
disclaimer.
ready. And then just to give you a visual display of where those schools are located throughout the county, I've kind of highlighted with these red circles the distribution throughout the county of where these new school sites are located. The next several slides are really just to let you know who we've been inviting to the conversations related to our public engagement activities. We have some very broad impact areas that we've outlined for each of these schools, simply to make sure that the entire community around this particular new school site is aware that the new school is coming and that there may be some impacts to their school site, maybe to their address and their particular assignment, or perhaps the school that they're attending might have a shifted attendance area. So as we invite families, we've had many that will say, I live so far away from this new school, why am I invited? We want to make sure the entire community is participating in the conversation so we don't, as a staff, miss out on any opportunities to learn more about the community and the community experience and the community's needs. Because of the nature of the size of the location of the facilities we've been using school sites and their media centers, we have restricted the invitations for these first sessions to those students that would potentially be matriculating at the year that the school would open. So the shorter way of saying that is for Woods Creek, since it's scheduled to open in 24-25, we only reached out to the current kindergarten, first and second grade students in this area, as they would be the ones most likely to be directly impacted by any assignment changes. The rest of the maps, these are all on our future school site. They have been there for a while, are the rest of the schools that are scheduled to open in 25-26. So this would be the Bowling Road impact area, again, very broad. There are 2 or 3 schools in this general region of the county that are scheduled to open very close in timing to each other. So the impact area for all of them could potentially be broad and overlap with each other, and there might be what you might refer to as a domino impact, that as space is made available at some existing schools, we might be able to backfill them with some students from other crowded or nearby crowded schools. So we, again, want to keep the conversation broad and wide so that as many families as possible are aware that these schools are under construction and getting ready to open in the coming school years. Here is a representative map for the impact area for Hilltop Needmore. Here we see one for Pleasant Plains Elementary, again, broad and wide because of that potential domino impact. We do not foresee that every single address in this area will be impacted. We just want to make sure that these communities are aware of the discussion. The potential for Rex Road, again, because it's part of that group where there's several elementary schools opening up in the area, we wanted to have a broad conversation with this region. Parkside Middle, again, we were pretty broad here. Because this was a middle school, we reached down a little bit lower and got some existing 3rd and 4th and 5th grade students who might potentially be matriculating up as the school opens in 25-26. Lots of families, we live so far from here, could we possibly be included? Maybe not being reassigned to Parkside, but perhaps we can make some adjustments to get you to a closer middle school as a result of the opening of this school. So lots of things can potentially impact here. This, I wanted to do 2 maps for you. This was our original impact map for Felton Grove, but those of you that participated with us in the fall when we did some reassignments that impacted Apex Friendship, Apex High School, as well as Cary and Greenhope as receiving schools, we've now reduced that impact map, and so what you'll see posted on our website is that a large majority of the areas that are north of US 1 have been removed from the impact area because their portion has already been adjusted. We preemptively did some adjustments in that area to prepare for the opening of Felton Grove, so they will not be impacted again once Felton Grove opens. So the new map that you'll see on the website is much smaller. As we move forward, then the next discussion item was to talk a little bit about what our capped schools and crowding looks like throughout the district. So here you see a list of the current capped elementary schools. This was the list you approved in February of this year. You'll notice in bold Apex Friendship, as that was added to the list in February. The one that you'll see missing is Sycamore Creek. It previously was listed as a capped school. You all did remove that during the approval process in February of this year. Here then is not specifically the CAP schools, it's all of our elementary schools and their state of crowding. This was shared with you in February during the facilities committee meeting when we talked about our enrollment projections. I believe the official title was long range enrollment projections. So this is the same map just brought back to you to remind you that in addition to our CAP schools, we also have several schools throughout the district that are experiencing crowding. For those of you that are looking far away, the red represents the most severely crowded at over 110% projected based on the allotments you were discussing during the budget conversation. The orange represents, yes, I'm looking correct, okay, between 100 and 110% projected crowding for next year. The yellow is a little bit above 90%, so between 90% and 100%, which still doesn't give us a lot of room to accept new students that move in during the school year. Any area that's listed as white is at or below that 90% threshold. And so this is our elementary school map. And again, you've seen this before, but I just wanted to bring it forward as a discussion topic. As we look at our capped middle and high schools, you can see the list. This is unchanged. You continued the caps at all of these schools going into the 23-24 school year. So Apex Friendship Middle, Mills Park Middle are still on the cap list. Apex Friendship, Heritage, and Panther Creek High Schools are all on the cap list. While I have your attention, know that the cap lets us have a sort of fixed amount of students that we know can safely and with academic integrity be served at these schools. Because a school is on this list does not necessarily mean that we're actively capping students out. So by way of example, Heritage High School hasn't hit that cap yet, but you have a proactive cap in place in the event that the developments in the area start to generate more and more students and we hit that number. So it is quite possible that a school on this list can still serve families that are moving into the base, so we always encourage families to reach out to the school first because it's quite possible they can be served, but as the year goes on, it is possible they might hit that upper threshold, that cap number, and then they might have to be assigned to what we call an overflow school. So call the school first. There is a chance you can actually still be served there. The map that we looked up for elementary school, I wanted to show you for middle and high school as well. So this is our area crowding projections for 23-24 at the middle school level. The color palette is the same as the previous map, with red being over 110% projected crowding. Not all of the ones that are red are on the cap list because we're still trying to use other strategies to handle the students at those schools. But it does give you an idea for the crowding throughout the county. We also have a similar map at the high school level. The next discussion topic we wanted to bring forward were our school choice options. Obviously, part of our assignment plan, if you look at the student achievement pillar, includes the idea that options would be available to families. We have to be careful and make sure that families know the base school is the assigned school for the address, and that any of these choice options that are provided are through an application process. They're not guaranteed. They're based on seat availability and any priorities that are in place for those particular options. However, every year when we're going through the enrollment planning process, we do seek to make sure that the choice options are continuing to support the goals of Board Policy 4150, particularly those for our magnet programs, as well as those for our operational efficiency standards, such as facility utilization. I am remiss in that it wasn't typed up here, but our transportation efficiency is included in this review as well. And then, of course, wherever possible, to address that proximity portion of your pillars to see if we can find a school that's more proximate for families that maybe are assigned to a school that's a little bit farther away. And then the final core discussion topic we have for you before we get into our proposed timeline is the historical assignment areas. Sort of a piggyback on that idea about proximity, we do have some assignment areas that are assigned to schools that are typically a farther distance away than maybe some of their neighbors, and it's been to align with and support the district goals, and we always want to make sure we're checking on these to make sure they're still aligned with the district's goals and to see whether or not more proximate options are available to support these students and still meet all of our goals for Policy 4150. So with that, I'll quickly walk you through our proposed timeline and next steps, and then I'll open for any discussion at the guidance of the chair. I know it's tiny, but I've tried to get it on one slide. So today we bring for you our initial planning discussion. That's the sort of first kickoff meeting for this annual process. As noted, between March and May, we're hosting those face-to-face public engagement sessions. Between May and June, we will continue and pick up from where we left off. A lot of the discussions we're having with our families and community members are keying us into some very specific core questions that we'd like to delve into deeper using focus groups. So we'll be partnering with our data research and accountability department to host those and get even more detail out of some of these ideas that are being generated. In addition, we'll start our work on the first draft of the plan. In June, I propose to come to you June 20th with an update on the progress of all of this public engagement that we've been doing, show you some report outs similar to what we did in the fall, what data we're getting out of our thought exchanges, participation rates, et cetera, and some general themes that we're getting either by region or as a county. Such that we'll continue developing draft 1 during that same time frame so that by September 19th, we propose being prepared for you with the first draft of the enrollment plan for 24-25. Once we release that draft to you as a board, we also then will immediately kick into some public information and engagement sessions to make sure that we can fully explain the proposal to the community and take any questions, feedback, or suggestions. It is very, very helpful to do this process for us as staff. Last year, we had 2 or 3 comments that were individual comments that led to really important adjustments to the assignment plan, as well as a lot of really important questions are generated so that we can help make sure the public is understanding the reasoning behind various recommendations, or if we can make adjustments where those can be made. We'll take all of that information, use it to provide a refined and revised version of the proposal for you such that we're bringing you the second draft in October. Again, we'll do one final push of public engagement to make sure families are aware of any changes that are included in that second draft and that they can provide feedback on any of those changes. And then we feel we'd be prepared to bring to you a final draft in November. I have left the dates as TBD, recognizing you haven't set your schedule that far out, and that we'll just need to work with the chair and to determine what days would be appropriate for the public hearing and or for the presentation of the final draft. And so with that, I kick it to you. Is there anything we've missed in this discussion, or do you have any questions about anything we've done so far?
Board members, any questions? Ms. Waters?
Thank you. This is incredible work, and I know a lot goes into it. I have a few questions about the regional sessions mentioned on page 6. Can you speak to like the number of people who attend and how they get connected to it? And are these regional sessions like standalone events, or are they attached to something else? Meaning, do families have to come out specifically for the sessions, or are they like in conjunction with PTA or other events where more families are inclined to be there? So that's a few questions.
So because this was our first time going back out into the public and we really wanted families to engage in dialogue, we created very structured sessions that are face-to-face driven. So for this first round, we have not offered a hybrid or a virtual option because we're doing small group discussions and whole group discussions, and we're really just starting a first conversation with some of our families. Yet, we know we need to continue and do more and create other opportunities. So these have been standalone sessions that were hosted by our office in partnership with the communications department. So the next phase will be, how do we reach even more families? And how do we plug in even more? First step that we did was immediately following the session, the thought exchange that we're using in the session, we pushed back out to everybody that was invited so that they could participate in that asynchronously with us. And then we'll continue moving forward by creating at least some videos of that initial presentation. A lot of it is similar to this, a little bit of facts about how we get to this point. And then we're going to work to create some hybrid or virtual versions for having dialogue back and forth with families as well. So this was step 1. And then the rest will continue to monitor over the summer and into the fall. Specific to the schools that are opening in 25, 26, we'll have a whole nother year to continue this process as well. So we're looking to modify all of our processes in the spring of next year as well to get more engagement and to get better access and equity.
Okay, okay, so
as far as the number of participants, we'll get that for you when we come in June, but we've had anywhere from 10 to 50 so far at each of the sessions.
and so in order to collect the feedback, is the thought exchange the method? So if someone attends, they have to then go to the thought exchange for their perspective to be captured. Is that what I understand? And the reason I ask is because I always have families who have different situations, probably in District 4, a lot of families who are more inclined to be disconnected from opportunities to provide input. And so sometimes I have families where we have a generational gap, where we have grandparents who are parenting grandchildren, and there's a technology gap. And so I always like to know how the process for collecting data is accessible to all people. So does one have to use the Thought Exchange in order for you all to be collecting the data or the information they're inputted?
The short answer is no. Certainly, any way that a family can get information to us, we will take it and we will process it. The convenience of the Thought Exchange for you as a board is that it gathers everything into one location where you can actually see all of the comments as well once I attach and release it to you. And it allows us to do some really important data analysis of the thoughts that are coming in. The longer answer is we know we need to do a better job, and we're continuing to partner with Dr. Chavis and his team into finding different ways to plug into communities that are appropriate community by community so we can gather the feedback in whatever way is best, which is why I wanted to start the process early so we'd have as much time to do these types of shifts in approach.
Okay.
So I appreciate you affirming that that's good work for us to be doing.
And one last question, talking about proximity, I know I have a number of families who have expressed in the Southeast Raleigh area their concerns about their children being in schools that are so far away in the Leesville area. I just wanted to put that as maybe an opportunity for further discussion with the community, see if that is something that could be addressed. And I know there's a lot of factors that go into it as considering all that you do, but did want to advocate for those families that have expressed that as an issue of proximity and their desire to be more engaged and involved in their children's education. So thank you.
Thank you.
Dr. Ng.
Hey, thank you so much for this presentation. I was at a function this past weekend, and a family that has a child with special needs came up to me and said, I can't get my child into this school and such and such. And she said, oh, I talked to other family, other parents, and they've had a hard time. And this may be beyond the scope of where you are, but can you comment on the involvement of the parents of kids with special needs, and how do they, are you getting their feedback on this process, and how do you do that?
So I'll take a piece of it and then I'll defer to Glenn because you've had some more experience with other elements of this. I notice from who's participating in the Thought Exchange and the comments that they're making and the comments that come up when we're having face-to-face conversations, terms like IEP and placement and academic access and so forth come up quite regularly. So I feel like that community is doing a good job of starting to plug into the conversation. So we are getting that feedback. By way of example, last year during one of our Thought Exchanges, there was a family or an individual who posted a comment, and maybe two other people posted similar comments, yet it had one of the highest support ratings of any other thought that we had in the Thought Exchange. Meaning as other community members saw that thought, they thought, yes, that's important. We really need to emphasize that, which is part of why I like the Thought Exchange, is because even if it is a small voice, you can get a lot of support. Second to that, in terms of getting into schools, is there work that we're...
So in the past, what we've done is outreach at some downtown schools. Generally, it's schools where our feedback was not, we did not get high numbers of feedback from those families in the past. It wasn't geared towards special ed, but it's certainly something that we can continue to work with, reaching out to our special ed departments at each school, notifying them of events in the area so they can help with identifying parents and seeking their input or sharing, where our outreach events are going to be. We can certainly do that in advance.
Yeah. Okay. So I think it's also important to note that our Special Education Services Department works pretty hard to ensure that our programs are available at as many schools as possible. And if something can't be in every single school, then they look at regional programs, and we see those sometimes as well. And then when an IEP is developed for a child, the expectation is that the IEP can be implemented in that school. So IEPs are not developed with a particular school in mind, but with the child in mind. And so because of that, you're always going to find in any group of families parents that might have a preference for one school over another school, or friends that are here versus there. But the answer to whether or not an IEP in particular can be implemented at a school is a decision that happens with the IEP team, which includes the families.
Mr. Haggerty and then Ms. Edmonds.
Thank you. So I have a question, but before I do, I wanted to just touch back on a point that Ms. Waters had raised, which is some of these historical assignment areas. You know, we have important district goals, but we have to make sure that those aren't falling on the backs of just certain students. And historically, from when a lot of these areas were historically written into our assignment plan, there's been a lot of changes in Raleigh's housing and neighborhoods. And I really believe if we look, we can accomplish a lot of these goals without requiring so many kids to go so far. So I support Ms. Waters and her request there. My question is just about the timeline and process, because I know this is the standard timeline that we've followed, and I know that the importance of the timeline is to make sure we can have all of these changes addressed far enough in advance to make sure we have transportation, staffing, and also stability for parents and families secured well in advance of assignment. But what I'm worried about are, and my colleagues have heard me say this before, so I apologize for being redundant, but changes pending in the legislature right now. We know that changes requiring new minimum class sizes for grades 4 and 5 have already passed one chamber of the legislature. And if they were enacted, it would put us over legal capacity at many of our elementary schools, and that would require a state-mandated reassignment. But it's not law yet. And so I know that puts you in a position of how do you design a plan without knowing what the law will be at the time that we'd be voting on the plan. And I know it's too demanding a task to ask for 2 contingent plans.
That's the plan.
So, but we also have other legislation that's coming out, some that would require open enrollment, where any student outside of Wake County would be required or could attend a Wake County school, and we would be denied any criteria for rejecting their application, even if we were denying kids inside Wake County the ability to attend that school. And there's some other pieces of legislation that would just do away with assignment and let everybody just apply to the school of their choice. So knowing that you can't come up with this many contingent or alternative plans, but that these things are out there, like what would we do if you're developing this plan and then over the summer, by July or August, one of these policy shifts happens? Would we push the plan back, or what would we do?
Before we answer that, I do want to acknowledge that we adjusted the plan cycle last year to make it November. I think typically you approve the plan in December. We got such positive feedback from families about having all of their answers to all of their questions before the holiday break. And to your point, it made so many other processes so much easier to prepare and plan for, which is why we're sticking to that. But I do want to acknowledge this would only be the second year of using this slightly advanced schedule.
And I'll say, please tune in to the Facilities Committee meeting on May 10th, because that is on our agenda, and it is pretty impactful, that conversation. As we shared at the previous Facilities Committee meeting, this will impact families, this legislation, and it will impact a lot of families, not just the ones in the overcrowded schools areas. And so we will highlight some of the issues and concerns that staff has with regards to that new legislation, in hopes that it'll draw attention to and support for understanding what its impact will be on our families. And so that will drive a lot of the work that we're doing with the assignment plan, and we're hopeful that we'll get some answers at some point before we get too deep into creating a plan, because our goal is to not create a plan and then scrap it and then start a new one in the middle of this process. I don't think people understand that while 24, 25 seems pretty far out for some people in making decisions, in our process, we're talking now today in April, May 23, for an assignment plan that starts in 24-25. And so, when we had the last class size legislation implementation, we had a 3-year window. This one is really only giving us a 1-year head start. And it's just not enough time for larger districts in order to, 1, create a plan, 2, properly educate the public and get their feedback as part of that plan, and then 3, actually implement it when you have so many moving parts.
Thank you.
Just the way that I'm talking about the Future Schools page of the website, the way I've heard you describe it, it sounds like to me it's definitely a work in progress. Do you have, and I know it's on here, spring, summer of this year, updating do you have, am I reading that right or hearing you correctly that it's not quite where you want it to be, and you can, I know it'll continue to be updated, but do you have a target date of when it'll be where you want it, like June 1st or something, and then you'll continue to add?
Absolutely. So our target is by on or around May 15th to have a big push and refresh and update based on what we're hearing from the engagement sessions. We're collecting a lot of questions about, we'd like to see this, we'd like to see this, and we want to curate all of that into that one location. So we'll have that as well as some videos that are sort of piggybacking on the conversations that we've had. Then to your point, from May 15th moving forward, it would be, please look back for regular updates, probably at least on a bi-weekly schedule until we get closer to the draft proposal being released. Thank you for calling that out.
Our goal is to make that site a place for parents who are existing as well as people moving to the area to know what's going on in your area. Because board feedback and previous board members had shared, people moving here don't understand how unique Wake County is. It's not like any other place you've lived. And so trying to get them as much information up front before they make decisions about where they'll live, what schools they want to attend, we're trying to give them as much feedback and information as possible.
And to make sure we continue on our path of over-communication, we'll continue to part with the community message system as well, and with our local principals to make sure we're continuing to let families know when to check back at the website and when to maybe come and join us at other conversations.
Certainly, we've come a long way since I came on the board of letting parents know with as much advance notice as possible. I am an optimistic person. I'm not optimistic that we'll have the details from the General Assembly before you need 2 plans, just FYI. But I guess my question is, we've done this, we've done the assignment plan in a systemic way. I guess my question is, and I certainly agree in supporting Ms. Waters' recommendation, which, as you all know, is a little tiny issue of mine of fixing all those little nodes across the county. But I guess maybe the question will be answered, are you going to talk about the larger impact of student assignment? Because generally, this is really geared toward the impact for 24-25. Ms. Waters brought up an issue that's a long-standing issue of this board to address, and that's not actually set in this plan. So I have a more directed question than a request of please do it. But are we going to do it? And I would hope that we'd also be talking about this in consultation with transportation, which I think now more than ever is a bigger issue of busing students across the district. So I have a very pointed question. Are we going to discuss student assignment in tandem with transportation needs within this process, which it's not articulated here, or are we going to discuss it separately in facilities? I feel like it's an elephant we can't ignore in this room. So that's my pointed question.
I'll add one piece to that. Capacity concerns in a particular area are an issue. So if you're looking at strictly transportation and proximity, you may be using a domino effect where it will upset or affect other families as part of that process. But it's certainly
I don't have an answer how to do it. I'm asking, are we going to do it?
So I'm going to step back and just say
Chris and I have some ideas about how to do it.
I was going to say, this is something, that exact topic, that I'd spoken to Mr. Carrozza about in facilities as they were talking about the student assignment plan and growth and capping, and sort of in planning our facilities committee meetings, when would the appropriate time be to bring it up? And should it be a facilities issue or a work session issue? Or both. And we didn't really agree on a time yet. And then one question that came up was also bring on a new superintendent. Should they be here to be a part of that? Or should we do it just to get everybody here up to speed on it first? And so there were a lot of questions, but we didn't necessarily come up with an answer yet.
I think it's also important to say here, the board directs policy here. So we're talking about two things, I think. First, possibly starting with a review of the existing assignment policy and determine, does it meet the requirements of what we're seeing, the shifts that we're talking about, the historical issues that we've addressed that are coming to the forefront, and where does it not, to determine if changes need to happen in policy. And then I think second, and sort of a parallel path, is direction from the board to staff to say, we want you to look at, because I think what this sounds like is if we were going to look at proximity as a leading component of the 4 pillars that are in the assignment policy right now, what would that impact be? And you're either going to tell us to do it, and we're not really looking at the impact, or we look at the impact and then you tell us do it, or do this part but don't do that part, or let's take 3 years to do it, or something along those lines. Because some of the assignments that you've talked about here today have been assigned since the inception of the school. But the county, the travel, the circumstances are different than so the school's not ever had any other assignments, but it's not the same district. It's not the same travel path. It's not the same neighborhoods.
It's not the same gaps in transportation, right?
That's right.
Of course, I've been talking about this for 10 years, but it feels, and I'm not saying anything new that Mr. Strickland doesn't know, it feels exacerbated to me to not, as one board member, to not ask for a targeted discussion around kids who are being more severely impacted than others.
And I do think it's the lowest number we've had in probably 10 or 20 years that are part of.
We've done some work.
Because we've done some work incrementally over the year, but that doesn't mean that there aren't still places where it remains. And so that is, I think that is a policy and a board direction.
I'm seeing head nods. Is that a direction that we want to give to staff? I know we've been talking about these historic notes for as long as I've been on the board. Ms. Johnson-Hostler has said she's advocated for looking at these.
As long as I've been on the board.
As long as she's been on the board, because of the changes, the gentrification, traffic patterns. Yeah.
I wouldn't want to have that conversation and get into a deep dive in that until the new superintendent is here, because I think it's really important that that person contribute.
I hear you, but I have one kid who has missed 10 days consecutively of school because of no transportation. And a kindergartner. That is a board decision for me personally. So while I don't disagree, but I assure you, whoever wants to be superintendent is watching our meetings. And if they're not, well, then they're not engaged.
So to Ms. Johnson-Hustler's point, I think there's some situations that probably need immediate triage, right? But then we also have some bigger work that we were doing, remember, with RTI that got interrupted before the closures of the pandemic. That's still there, and we never completed it. And it might be worth bringing that back out as part of the review. I have just, back in my desk where we've looked at all of, and the data's old now, but it was each school and like free and reduced lunch percentages, trying to see where our highest poverty schools are, right? And where there's areas that could bring them more into balance. And in some cases, some of these historic notes.
Yeah. Chris and I looked at old data. We weren't talking about literally overcrowding the school that's overcrowded. There are some schools in closer proximity. Again, that was old data that we looked at.
But just we know, to the superintendent's point, and I'll pick a school in my district, when Leesville High School was built, there are many more neighborhoods in that area that simply didn't exist. And when you look now at the nature and the makeup of that district, we can have a really great, well-balanced school that represents that community without having to pull kids from, like Davie Street and Tarboro Road to drive all that way in the morning. If they want to, by a transfer of school choice thing, that's one thing. But if they don't have any say in the matter and the families can't accommodate it, that's different.
I think what I'm seeing is we'd like to have that discussion. And I think it will help our new superintendent to learn more about this district and how it has changed over time. But I think there's urgency to it now, given especially our transportation piece, where kids aren't able to come to school, and you read those transfer appeals of it's $50 for me to get an Uber to go get my kid when there's an emergency. It's heartbreaking. And so I think we can, both and this, but at least give staff, who hopefully, we expect that you will still be here presenting this in the fall, will be sharing that, and so we can have a look at it, because that was work to what Mr. Hegarty referenced. We were looking at the economic health index across the county to get a better understanding of not just particular areas, but all areas across the country or the county where we might have students that were having that. So I think that we can certainly have that difficult conversation and start a plan to address it, for sure.
Direction taken. To answer the initial question, of course, we are always underlying transportation efficiency and facility utilization in a lot of our reviews. So there's a softer version of it that's happening at all times, but to your point, this very pointed conversation requires a slightly different lens.
Are there other questions at this time?
No, just a comment that
Yep.
transportation efficiency and proximity are linked. And so, I think you can look at the proximity and then the transportation efficiency may just kind of come along, but that's
We're going to move on to our Bell Schedules update. This is an extension of our last Student Achievement Committee meeting. We will look at the Bell Schedule information previously shared with the board. And we will be joined by Drew Cook and Brad McMillan to look at the Oh, fun. Yes, sir.
My stomach's growling.
I might actually take some and grab it right. Thank you.
I thought you were doing that.
Every time I get this, I do not love it. I'm like, where did you get this over? Or you see busy work. It says it's busy. Oh, you just thought I'd get it?
No, Chris.
Oh. I looked at you and I was like, maybe Tyler's, I thought maybe you were hiding yours behind your,
He grabbed the pack and then, we got it. No, Ms. Waters, as we're getting set up, since this is coming out of your committee, is there anything that you want to share before we get started?
I don't think so.
Okay. Thank you for that.
Are we ready, Ms. Mahaffey?
I believe so, yes. Let's get started.
All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for the opportunity, as Ms. Mahaffey referenced, to continue the brief conversation that we had when we ran out of time a few weeks ago in our Student Achievement Committee meeting on Bell schedules. Our primary, and I'm happy to say that looks like we do have more than 15 minutes today to dive into this. Our goal is really to do a little bit of review in terms of where we've been. But the primary goal today is for Dr. McMillan to review with you. By the way, he wasn't here for the Student Achievement Committee meeting. I'm very thankful, and you will be too, that he is here to go through some of the data, particularly some of the feedback that's been gathered from various stakeholder groups, so we'll do that. And the primary goal as we conclude is to provide the board with an opportunity to do some reflecting, some discussing, and ultimately provide some guidance and feedback on what you see as next steps in this process. And we'll talk a little bit more about that moving forward. So just a quick overview of our desired outcomes that I've really just referenced. We'll use a reflection protocol that you have in front of you. This is also in Assembly, so if others want to access it, they certainly can. But we wanted to provide you with something to kind of take notes, jot down questions. It's called a 3-2-1 protocol. We'll talk more about that in just a few minutes. Ultimately, the outline of our discussion today is after a quick overview, we'll share and present information on the relevant research that for some is a review, and also new information on the stakeholder feedback that's been gathered going back a couple of months ago since the last deep conversation with the board on this back in the fall. We'll quickly review some of the sample bell schedule options that you've got in your materials that we've discussed previously. And then we will importantly engage in a protocol to get some small group feedback, and then come back for some table discussion again with the goal of hearing your feedback and direction in terms of next steps or where we want to go with this conversation in the future. In front of you, you've got the 3-2-1 document. Essentially, what we'd like for you to do, and you can use this to the degree that you feel appropriate and necessary. The 3-2-1 protocol really is to write down 3 key points or implications to consider. And you can do that for both of the 2 sections that Dr. McMillan will go through. 2 questions that resonate or that are lingering in your mind about that topic. And also, importantly, a potential next step. And obviously, feel free to deviate to the degree that you need to. If you've got more questions than 2 or more thoughts on next steps, certainly share that. And then we'll break up into small groups for about 15 minutes or so to kind of synthesize some of this work, identify some trends, and then come back to the table and engage in dialogue to close up. We talked about this last time, just a quick re-reference in terms of the alignment with our strategic plan and those core beliefs. And then just a quick recap of the timeline that we've been engaged in now going back a couple of years ago. Obviously, more than half of our board members have not been engaged in this process previously, so we'll try to strike the balance between differentiating to different groups, also recognizing we do have some important new information for everyone today, particularly in regards to the stakeholder feedback information that Dr. McMillan will share. So that's a quick overview, and I'm going to turn it over to Brad and let him take us through the core of the presentation and new information.
All right, thank you, Drew. So I know that some of you may have heard some of this at the previous meeting that Drew referenced, but I do want to make sure that kind of everybody has the same grounding. And so I'll go ahead and go through some of the slides that were reviewed last time. These first few are basically a little overview of about some research over the last couple of decades about the impact of sleep deprivation and poor sleep quality on what students are able to do and accomplish in school. And there's a pretty serious body of research that basically says that it's generally not good on a lot of dimensions. About a quarter of high school and middle school students in that first study there reported falling asleep in school at least once a week. And that a lack of sufficient sleep or a lack of sleep quality has all kinds of other implications for kids in terms of their own personal health as well as their academic performance in school. It increases risk of depression. It also makes them more likely to be tardy or absent, and has a host of other negative cognitive impacts, such as having them be less alert, less attentive. It can affect their memory, their motivation, and even their decision-making processes that they have. And we know that students need to be mentally ready to engage with school when they walk through the door in order to take advantage of the things that we want them to accomplish. Also, beyond that, there's a little bit more nuance that shows that students who are chronically sleep deprived tend to perform worse in the morning than they do in the afternoon as well. And so that extra time it takes in the morning has a particular impact on, say, their first or second period class more so than anything else. Not surprisingly, on the other hand, students who do have good quality sleep, whose sleep duration is more developmentally appropriate in terms of number of hours they're getting per night, as well as sleep quality, depending on how you operationalize it, because those are not necessarily the same things, even though they're related. Do tend to perform better in school, have higher GPAs. Basically, it's the flip of all of the things that we see from students who are chronically sleep deprived. And there's a list of citations down here at the bottom. If you want more information on those, we can certainly send you some of those studies offline. But I will point out that there is a report on our website from 2021 that summarizes a lot of this stuff. It's available right there at that link, where we undertook an overview. And many of these studies are part of what that review sort of encompassed. Also, although a lot of these are self-report observational type studies, there have actually been some experimental studies where students have been have intentionally engaged in more or less sleep at night. Like some students are assigned to sleep less and sleep more, that show some of these same effects. So it's not necessarily that kids who are inclined to sleep less are not doing well in school anyway. There is a sort of a causal relationship here that they've been able to demonstrate through some experimental studies as well. So because of this, start times are obviously a big point of conversation around the country, and like many districts, with high school kids in particular, that's where a lot of the energy seems to be in terms of the conversation. And of course, we have a situation where our high school kids, our oldest kids, are starting school earliest in the morning, which puts them at a little bit more risk for being sleep deprived and not being able to, when school starts at 7:15, 7:18 in the morning. However, it's not such a simple thing to say, well, then we'll just make kids start later, because there's, of course, a lot of other things that are impacted by that, not the least of which are parents' other schedules. When parents go to work, when they have to drop off other children for childcare situations. We have school personnel, many of whom work second jobs, and sometimes being able to get out of school early by starting early allows them, or even allows many of our students, to access after-school jobs or jobs that they can work in the afternoon. And then, of course, there's things like older students being able to be at home in the afternoon to be able to provide childcare for younger siblings, which, if they were to go to school later in the day, might be a more difficult thing to do, and then there might be an issue where there would be an additional need for childcare, say, for some families who can't take advantage of that sort of serendipity there, where the older kids get out earlier and can pick up the younger ones at the bus. So a lot of people's lives are structured in such ways that it's kind of adapted itself to this, so any potential changes would have to be considered sort of in light of that, I guess would be the best way of saying it, because it's not happening in a vacuum. So with that, I'm going to hand it back to Drew, and he's going to refer you to the protocol that we've shared with you all here today to capture some comments.
Yeah, thanks, Brad. So we're just going to pause for just a second and give you, I know sometimes in a formal setting, silence can be uncomfortable, but we're going to give you a couple of minutes on the form for you to reflect and think about specifically the research that Brad just went through, and record 3 key points or implications that you heard. Again, it doesn't have to be exactly 3. 2 questions or clarifications you may have, and then if there is a next step or 2 related to the research and the information that Brad just shared, take this time for a couple of minutes to record that, and then we're going to do the same thing after we go through the next section that Brad presents as well. And one last thing that I do want to point out on your document, if you didn't notice already, I want to draw attention. We are working through Policy 1150 and thinking about the equity lens. And so as you're recording and as you're thinking, we just wanted to share some of those questions to think about in terms of implications, potential disparate impacts on student subgroups, and even how this work might advance the work of our district's core beliefs and equity work moving forward. So take 2 minutes and then we'll circle back and Brad will continue with the next section. another minute just based on the number of pencils and pens that are still moving. Finish up the last thought. Anybody need more time? All right, so hold those thoughts. And of course, this will be interesting as we get into some of the stakeholder feedback to see how that kind of juxtaposes with some of the thoughts and implications you've already recorded. So I'll turn it back over to Brad.
All right, thank you all. So last fall, when we brought some of this information to the board, we were given the instructions to go ahead and sort of dig a little bit deeper and collect some data from our actual stakeholders that we have here in the district around some of these topics. And so last October, we created and distributed a survey actually there were 4 of them. There was one for parents, there was one for staff members, at all of our K-12 schools. There was one for high school students and another one for general community members, anybody who didn't fit into one of those 3 groups who nonetheless wanted to weigh in on the survey. And the survey was really a bit of a thought experiment. We presented the graphic that you see here as an alternative bell schedule that the district might potentially consider, which is different from the one that we have now in one simple way. It basically takes elementary schools and high schools and flips them. Currently, our high schools start first in that first tier, middle schools are second tier, and elementary schools are third tier in terms of those bell times. And so the thought experiment we asked people to engage in, and some of you may have been respondents to the survey back in the fall, was if we did flip elementary and high school, how would that impact things, in your opinion, in several areas? And so we presented all kinds of different dimensions of this and asked people to weigh in on whether they thought our current schedule was preferable or this alternative schedule was preferable, or maybe it was a wash and it was no difference either way on a number of dimensions that we know are important to people from the existing research on this. So the community group survey, we're not going to share that with you today only because we got so few responses to it. We didn't really know what to make of it. We only had 83 people respond to sort of the community survey, which was not, I'm not a parent, I'm not a student, I'm not a staff member. And so we do have those and we can share with you offline, but it's not in the presentation available here today. It was available in English and Spanish, and our communications department helped us push it out through our website and our social media channels. The student survey was actually emailed directly to all high school students to their Wake County email addresses, so it came directly to their inbox. So we made a lot of efforts to make sure that it was accessible in multiple languages and to try and push it out through as many channels as we could. And so I'm going to give you just a high-level summary of what the results showed us, and then I'll show you some specific examples in a series of charts. But at the overall level, considering across our stakeholder groups and across different grade spans, just at the 60,000-foot level, basically people thought that the current schedule was much better for anything that happened outside of school, but that the alternative schedule of having high school kids start later and elementary school start earlier was generally preferable for students in school as far as their health, their attendance, their ability to be present and be engaged with their work. So it was a bit of a dichotomy, as you might imagine, for folks. we also broke down the data a couple of different ways. We broke it down by respondent groups. So we have results separately for parents, for staff, and for students. And then we also broke it down by grade spans because we were pretty sure that depending on whether you were in high school, or middle school, or elementary school, you're already in a different slot. You may feel a little bit differently about that. Because sometimes where you stand depends on where you sit. As we unpacked that a little bit, it got a little bit more complicated. So for example, elementary parents generally preferred the current schedule almost across the board, even for the in-school stuff, because of course they're probably thinking about their particular child who's not the one starting at 7:15 in the morning, having to drive through traffic to get to school and those kinds of things. So elementary parents were pretty positive across the board about the current one, but as you get up to the middle and high school parents, they tended to tip toward the alternative schedule of having older kids start late, again, potentially because that's the lens that they're looking through at this particular point. And then also when we looked at the staff results, those also varied by grade span as well. Staff generally felt that, it's better for in-school stuff to flip the schedule. Current school stuff would be better for out of school. But with respect to their own personal impacts, like their own work schedule, their own family schedule as staff members, the higher grades folks really like the schedule that they have because it allows them to get out of school early. Again, now I can pick up my younger children, now I can go to my second job, et cetera, et cetera. Whereas staff in the lower grades actually preferred the alternative schedule, meaning that maybe elementary teachers felt like there might be some good reasons why they might want to get out of school before 4 o'clock in the afternoon as well. So it was really mixed. And then the last question that we asked folks was basically for elementary and for middle or high, what is the absolute best time to start school and the absolute best time to end school? And basically, regardless of the respondent group and regardless of the grade span, everybody wants school to start around 8:45 and be done by 3:15 for every single student. And of course, you all know the complications in doing that with the 3-tier bus system. We would have to have like something a little bit more robust than what we have to accommodate that. So I'm going to take you through a series of charts here. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on each one of them, but I do want to spend some time on the first one just because they're all kind of parallel as we go through, just to orient you to the colors and what we're doing here. So there's going to be 2 charts on each slide, and we're going to have a bar for elementary parents, a bar for middle school parents, and a bar for high school parents, going from left to right within each of those. That's what the ES, MS, and HS are for. And the green is the percentage of people in that group who prefer the current schedule the way it is. The blue bar and the percentage within it is the percent who prefer the alternative schedule, and then the yellow at the top is the percentage of parents who said it's fine either way, neither of them is preferable in this particular dimension. And so on this first chart right here, we ask parents how advantageous are these schedule options for your students before or after school care and for your own personal work schedule. And so here, sort of going left to right on the first chart, you can see that elementary school parents were more excited about the current schedule for before and after school care and their own work schedule, whereas middle school and high school parents less so. And again, this probably has to do with them being in that slot that kind of works for them. So you can see there is some variation here by grade span. Although it seems, although the blue is generally larger than the green at the elementary level, it's flipped a little bit. So that's kind of how there's a little bit of an interaction here between whatever grade level you're in and how you tend to feel about this. Looking at, again, this is a more interesting one because it shows activities outside of school on the left and activities inside school on the right. And so when we look at parents' preferences for those outside school activities, even at the high school level, everybody likes the current one better. Again, they've already got their lives kind of oriented around it because it's the one we're sort of doing. But then when you move over to the right and you look at academic performance, now middle and high school parents say overwhelmingly that the alternative schedule would be much better for their students' academic performance while they're in school. So there's a little bit of that split that we're talking about. And then we see the same thing here with student health on the left, which is more of a within-school factor. You can see even elementary parents are starting to tip a little bit more towards the alternative option there. But then when we look at my student's work schedule, for those families for whom that's an issue, if their child does have a job at all levels, they prefer the current schedule over the alternative one because, of course, those kids who are most likely to have jobs are the ones getting out of school earliest to make sure that they can get to those jobs. And then, of course, a lot of families in that case, their student doesn't have a job, they're probably in that yellow portion of the bar up there on the top. Now here we've got a couple of in-school factors, my students' attendance at school and my students' alertness at school. And again, we're going to see a pretty familiar pattern. Middle and high school parents feel like the alternative schedule would be more beneficial for their child on both of those fronts, whereas the elementary parents feel the opposite. They like the current schedule for their particular child. And then on the next one, we've got another one where we've got the child's ability to complete their homework and their overall family schedule. So these are a couple that are more into those out-of-school factors. And on the left-hand side, you can see that preference for the alternative schedule is a little bit stronger for middle and high school, but they're really not tremendously different from elementary there. And then when you look at the overall family schedule, elementary parents love what they have, but middle and high school parents would prefer the other type of option. So there is some variation there, among parents depending on what level you're at. Even though at the overall level, the in-school, out-of-school split maintains, it's even a little bit different when you start looking at grade spans. So we did a similar thing with staff. And this is, again, K-12 staff, so we have elementary, middle, and high. And here again, you'll see some patterns where it depends on what grade span you're in, how you feel about these things. Personal work schedule, high school staff love it the way it is. The green bar is huge. But elementary, middle school staff would prefer elementary staff in particular would prefer the alternative schedule. So getting out at 4 or sometimes 4:30 or 5 if you've got some after-school duties. Elementary staff are looking at that 2:15 and thinking, well, I could get a lot more done. I can run to the bank. I can pick up my children, et cetera, et cetera. So there's some disparate preferences by grade span there. And then when we look at students' activities outside of school, as far as extracurriculars or music lessons or whatever else sports they might be doing, even at the high school level, high school staff say the current schedule is much better for those out-of-school things. And of course, you can imagine why. Starting football practice, band practice, all those other activities earlier in the day means you can get them done before dinner, you can still get your homework done. Whereas at the elementary level, the staff felt the opposite. Looking at some in-school factors for students' academic performance and health, across the board, staff felt like for students' health and academic performance, the alternative schedule was the clear winner, even at the elementary level. So there was some consistency there as far as students' in-school experience. Now again, flipping to a combination of students' work schedules, an out-of-school factor, and then attendance and in-school factor, you can again see the split where staff felt like students' work schedules are much better accommodated with the current Bell schedule, but their attendance would probably be anticipated to be better under the alternative schedule where high school kids could start later in the day. And then here again, we have an in-school factor and a more out-of-school factor with respect to alertness within the school day. Elementary, middle, high school staff felt like the alternative again was better. But with respect to students' ability to complete their homework, it differed. You can see that high school staff felt like the current schedule was going to help students complete their homework more efficiently, again, because they've got more hours in the day after school to be able to do that, particularly after they do whatever else, after-school activities, dinner, et cetera. To be able to do that. So that varied by grade span as well. And again, they're probably thinking of their own lens of the workload, which of course we know is much higher at high school, et cetera, for the average student. And then with respect to their personal work and family schedules, again, here you see big differences by grade span. Elementary staff really want to be able to get out of school a little bit earlier. High school staff really want to be able to get out of school earlier. So the preference among staff there is, again, depending on where you're situated, you have different levels of preferences there as far as how it impacts the staff's life. And then for their children's before or after school care, only about half of families expressed, or half of staff members expressed a preference here. Elementary thought the alternative would be better. Again, getting out earlier would help them, but middle and high school staff felt that the current schedule was better off for their own child's before or after school care. So again, it's very, very mixed, even among staff. And then this last chart I'm going to show you here is the results from the students, and we've got all of those different dimensions here on the same chart because we only surveyed high school students. We didn't survey students at other levels. And just looking from left to right, if you can see where sort of the green bar peaks, right? Outside of school activities, work schedule, completing homework, family schedule. I like getting out at 2:15. But as far as being alert, being to school on time, my own health, my own academic performance, I'd be better off starting school later. So that same dichotomy is present among even our students' opinions as well. So because survey stuff tends to be kind of a mile wide and an inch deep, we went sort of an extra step and we met with the Superintendent's Teacher Advisory Council as well as the Superintendent's Student Leadership Council this winter after these survey results came in. And we shared kind of a high-level overview of what the results were, not that the level of detail you all have seen here today, but we basically asked them some follow-up questions, and the big one we wanted to know was, well, given all of this, do the potential benefits of a change like this outweigh the downside, yes or no? And we've got 3 quotes here from teachers at each level, and I'll just leave them up and let you read them for about 30 seconds here, and then we'll come back and show you what the students have to say. So basically what you're even hearing from staff is, yeah, we know maybe if through the academic lens it's the right thing to do, there's a lot of other impacts here that we have to consider that might be just trading one set of problems for another or potentially be even more intractable problems. And then when we asked the students, we heard some of the same things actually. Or the little quote there from the middle school student, kind of in the middle of that quote, it just fits. We're already adjusting. It's the devil we know, so to speak. We've oriented our lives. And then the high school student, their group said they would not vote for it because the potential positives would not happen. I think this is a really important point. Like if we move the bell schedule, the unspoken assumption here is that kids will actually sleep more.
That's my favorite. Every group of students I've ever talked to.
You know, if I'm
like,
now I'm
not
up
gonna
till
go to bed early.
11 or 12 doing my homework because I'm getting out later, and all I'm doing is just moving everything forward by 2 hours if I'm not getting any more sleep. Or if I
Anybody
choose
who
to.
has a teen knows the answer to that question.
Yeah.
And they all unanimously have said the exact same thing every time I've talked to them.
Yeah, and so if
I
some
could
of
go
the
to bed
high school
later.
kids kind of admitted that.
For any reason.
That may not happen.
They'll get up later, they just might have been asleep.
Yeah, exactly.
So we'll pause right there again, recognizing that what Brad just shared is a lot to digest. And so again, we'll give you 2 or 3 minutes thinking about the feedback that Brad just shared, implications, questions, and a potential action step or 2 based on what you just learned. And then we're going to circle up and break out into small groups in just a few minutes and get into some dialogue. So take 2 or 3 minutes and report your thoughts. Another 30 seconds or so. Anybody need more time? All right, thank you for that. So before we break into a couple of small groups and then get engaged in some dialogue, reflection, and feedback, we did want to take a few minutes to kind of review again some of the examples or options that we've put together that have been implemented in other districts across the country. Just for your reference, this may help inform some of the thoughts and reflections and discussion that we have in just a few minutes. But here's just a quick overview of the three options, the first of which is to shift all bell schedules back in the day, and we'll share what that can look like in just a second. Option 2 essentially is flip-flopping elementary with high school, same times, start, end, just flip-flopping elementary and high school. And then option 3 you'll see is really kind of a combination of the first two, where we would flip-flop elementary and high school and also potentially consider moving everyone back by 30, 45, or 60 minutes. And here you see just a quick overview of option 1. I don't know that there's a middle ground in this discussion, but some have referenced that this option may be as close to quote-unquote a middle ground, where we're not flip-flopping elementary with high school that has significant implications in time and access to opportunities, work life, all those kinds of things. What you see here is what a bell schedule might look like if we just kept the high school, middle school, elementary school tier in that order and just moved everything back by 30 minutes, 45 minutes, or 60 minutes. Obviously, the further to the right that you go, the later in the day it goes, and vice versa on the left. I will mention that according to research, even a 30-minute later in the day start does have positive impact on attendance and academic performance, again, depending on which research study you look at. So even 30 minutes could make a detectable difference. And then here in example 2, this is where we could just flip-flop elementary with high school, right? And you have your elementary students starting earlier in the day, high school starting later in the day. I don't have to go through all the different implications of that Brad just shared and what that might mean for families, but also what it could mean potentially for students academically and attendance-wise during the school day. Some of the benefits of this option is it would allow for a later start time, obviously, for high school students, which is where the preponderance of research indicates there's the most negative impact for the earlier start as opposed to younger students. It is something that I think from a transportation standpoint that could be feasible based on what our team has shared. It would also place elementary on Tier 1, and I think the rationale here is that could also save time for students. I think the earlier in the day you are on Tier 1, the less kind of late buses, and you know how that works, where if you're 5 minutes late on Tier 1, it becomes 10 minutes late on Tier 2, and by Tier 3 it could be 30 minutes late, and so that could mitigate some of the late arrival or dismissal times for younger students. And we do know that these are examples, in this example in particular, that other districts have been able to successfully implement, even in some cases on a multi-tier bus structure like what we're sharing. And then example 3, again, is kind of a combination of option 1 and option 2, where we could flip-flop and move back times, whether it's 30, 45, or 60 minutes. So, and that's just 3 examples. I'm sure there's other options that are out there, but those are 3 that I think potentially could be feasible based on all the research and feedback that we've gathered. 3 tiers. In 3 tiers, yes, which we know we have to have based on just the capacity in our transportation system. That's just a reality that we're obviously all working with. So that's a quick overview of some of those options and what we wanted to do for the remainder of our time. And I've got to say thank you for being good sports, and because I know I've been watching your pencils move and pens move. I know there's lots of questions, lots of thoughts, and we want to get to that. And so what we're going to do now, similar to maybe what we did last week, is break up into small groups. And you see here we've got Group A with Ms. Mahaffey. I'm going to have to turn around because I don't have my glasses on. Ms. Mahaffey, Ms. Johnson-Hostler, Mr. Hershey, Mr. Eames in Group A, Ms. Caulfield, Mr. Haggerty.
We're quorum anyway, so it's fine.
Ms. Waters and Swanson. Yeah, I've got them in my pocket. I was just determined I was not going to use them. So we're going to break up into 2 groups. We've got some chairs set up in the big boardroom. We felt like it'd be good just to spread out a little bit so we're not so condensed in this room. And we've got Michelle Woodson and Alicia Miller who are going to help facilitate each of those 2 breakout groups. We're going to kind of devote 15 to 20 minutes max to really follow the protocol that we've got, but in 3 rounds give you an opportunity to summarize key points, identify questions and clarifications, and also identify some of those next steps. And then the idea is when we get back in the room, we'd like you to have a reporter for each group, if that's okay, just to kind of share out kind of trends from the group, from both Group A and Group B. And at that point, we'll engage kind of an open dialogue and discussion at the table, again, with the ultimate goal from our standpoint of hearing clearly your feedback in terms of where you'd like this conversation to go moving forward. We're not looking for a decision today, but I think we're looking for a pathway to reach a decision based on what the board's feedback is. So that's kind of a quick overview of the plan. Any questions or clarifications before we break into those 2 small groups and come back in just a few minutes?
Which group is going where?
Figure it out when we get in there.
All right, that will be in the big boardroom, and we'll see you back in about 15, 20 minutes. is maybe just hear a quick synopsis from each of the two groups, Group A and Group B, just in terms of some of the key implications, questions, next steps that came from those groups. So maybe we'll start with Group A, and if you have a reporter, we'd love to hear what some of the discussion was from your group.
So the key points and implications, agreement that benefits do not outweigh the change, do not outweigh, how did we phrase it? Is that how we phrased it in Group A?
The benefits don't outweigh the detractions.
The detractions, yeah. Okay. And a very key point is sleep is important. For our questions, they kind of got into what community members were surveyed. Since there was a low number, were we intentional about reaching out to daycares, for instance, or any groups that provide some sort of after-school care or after-school programming? Any kind of after-school events that cater to K through 12. How do students, one question was, how many high school students provide childcare, but we modified that to really any kind of after-school commitment, because it could be additional academics, it could be athletics, it could be a job, it could be childcare. How do students currently get to and from school? Is there data on elementary school students similar to in the first slide, or one of the first slides you talked about middle school and high school, the data on middle school and high school students sleeping every day? Some percentage were sleeping once a day in class, or sleeping in class once a day. Do we have that same information on elementary school students? I kind of jumbled that, but you got it right.
Yep.
All right. And then the impacts of sliding the time back 15 minutes rather than 30. And whether it's on health or academics or hitting traffic at a worse time, or what would be the case. Next steps, is there a need for a contract, outside voice effectively, to look at transportation with fresh eyes? Have we asked transportation how to make positions more attractive? And have we asked staff, transportation or otherwise, about sliding start times if we started significantly later? You know, retaining, we gotta make sure we retain staff and when we make these decisions.
Especially those that may have second jobs.
Correct. Yep.
Thank you. Any other thoughts from Group A? We'll open it up for the whole group here in just a second.
Just that second point on the next steps. It's not just asking transportation, like the folks in charge of transportation, but speaking to our bus drivers. Something like a working condition survey. How can we make it better for them for retention purposes, and how can we potentially attract more folks to the profession, and hearing directly from them.
Okay. All right, Group B.
All right, so implications, and there's certainly some commonality between the two groups. Transportation vacancies are a concern, but even if that were not an issue, we're just wondering how our three-tier bus system, which is somewhat unique, I know other districts have it, but not a lot, you know, how does that impact a change? The lack of transportation resources, similar to what Group A said. Safety of our younger students in the dark, if they were to go earlier, because not all parents can be out there with their child or have someone with their child in those early morning hours. Somebody who said secondary impacts on academics, because I don't know how to interpret that for the group.
I think it's the same, talking about the impact of additional sleep has been shown to have a positive impact on academic performance.
The variation in stakeholder feedback, just the fact that it seemed pretty inconsistent. So that was, with the survey results you shared, that was of concern. the various out-of-school impact, jobs, doctor appointments, et cetera, the impact on childcare. And then secondary students unsupervised in the afternoon, that could have potential discipline issues. So questions going forward, we want to know how other districts comparable to us, such as with a 3-tier transportation, similar size, what has happened when they've done this? You know, did a lot of parents flee the system, or just how did it go? Do you weigh the number of students affected versus the impact? For example, there may not be a lot of students that are impacted by after-school jobs. That might be a small number. So how do you weigh something like that with the impact? What input have we gotten from stakeholders outside? You shared that there weren't many community responses, but have we been talking to our child care providers, employers of teenagers, et cetera? Is it possible to have a pilot with an X number of schools? How does this impact athletic schedules? And what have we learned from our elementary school that have early start times? And we discussed, you know, which school those are in the district currently. You know, what does it mean for our existing elementary students to start at, say, 7:45 or, you know, 8 a.m.? Next steps for planning. If we make changes, consider the impact and the implications to all school levels, and the 2 hours versus like a 20-minute adjustment. We need more information about those other districts that are comparable to us that have actually done this. We would like additional feedback, given that context and change for stakeholders. Tyler, you said that really well. Just that when the survey was done in 2021, we were just coming out of the pandemic, just coming out of remote learning. Jobs now have shifted to more remote. More people are working remotely. So we might want to revisit those new factors that we may not have considered in the survey in 2021. And then possibly having staff bring us a draft of what a pilot might look like.
Okay. Any other thoughts from the second group? All right, well, thank you for this feedback and for the discussions. And what we'd like to do for the remainder of our time is really just dialogue at the table and hear from the board. I can make an attempt to synthesize what we just heard, and you all can push back and ask questions. But it sounds like if we've still got questions, and I think both groups, one of the commonalities that we heard is that there is a desire for some additional information and a deeper dive. For example, Ms. Edmonds, you just referenced, okay, we've referenced broadly that there are some 3-tiered systems that are being utilized nationally. Who are those districts? Can we engage with them to learn how they did it? What was the runway? What was the timeline? What worked? What didn't work? And I think also I heard reference to the potential for a pilot, and which indicates, at least broadly, that there's a desire to pursue more learning about what this might look like. And again, don't let me put words in the board's mouth, but what I'm taking from this at first glance is that there is energy to continue the conversation. And I know for some of our veteran board members, this has started a couple of years ago. This is a new board, and it's new for most. But we also recognize that there is a lot of competing priorities right now. And so, one of the things, if we go back to the fall discussion in terms of our timeline, was that if we were thinking about changes for the 24-25 school year, one of the pieces of feedback that we did get clearly that day was we'd like to have at least a 1-year runway to communicate and plan for that. So another question may be, as we're gathering additional information and feedback based on the questions and next steps that the board has identified, which I think are attainable, is there any thought or conversation around the timeline that collectively we should be aiming for? Are we still thinking about, even if it's a pilot, 24-25? Or is this a conversation in terms of managing the important priorities with the new strategic plan and everything else, are we looking a little bit further out into the future? We can go in either direction, but I just wanted us to be clear and understand what the will of the board is in that regard.
What do you guys think?
I would not personally push this for 24, 25. Like, anything would have to be after that. The
Yeah.
transportation piece is so critical that we have to get everything in line first.
I think,
But more information is welcome.
yeah, I think the thing that overwhelmingly was in our group was that, you know, finding out, and I think in the literature review and some work that we did earlier, we saw that the Anne Arundel School District mentioned that they had hired a contractor to do kind of a transportation audit. I think something like that may be helpful to see where our, you know, efficiencies are, what we can do given the constraints that we have, you know, and seeing if it's even possible. But I think for us, it was looking, you know, getting fresh eyes, because when you're in that work day in, day out, it's not always possible to take that step back. And I think, you know, anybody who was in a position during the pandemic knows that that can be rough to take that step back and try to think outside the box, which I think that box was like crushed and dead and like on the side of the road at one point. Ms. Waters?
I want to echo Mr. Hershey's point. Pushing it out is something that I think would work better. I do have sort of an interest in, because based upon the presentation, it looked like all the schools start at the same time, but there is a bit of variation between the school start times. So I'm kind of interested in learning a little bit more about how particular schools got at their start times and how they impact families. Because to me personally, I have a child that needs to be at Carroll by 7:30, and then I can drop my child off at Brentwood Elementary at 8 o'clock, so that works perfectly for my family. And I've spoken with other families who have not gone to particular schools because the start time was different. So just based upon the existing start times, I'd be interested in seeing all the start times for our schools and how they got to that point, and what lessons we've learned and what families have said about their experience with those particular start times before I would be interested in kind of moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you.
I agree with the comments that have been shared thus far, but I think as relates to the transportation audit, I think although if we push the start time out to 26, or what up to 26, 25, 26 academic school year, or 26, 27, I think an outside audit to examine how our transportation works, what's not working, what could go best, could help us for the upcoming school year. To the point that Ms. Johnson-House was saying, we have a fresh set of eyes to see what's working. And as we're in this transition phase for the district, I think it can always help us think better and do better and acknowledge the work that is going on with us.
This might be a big exclamation point for some, but do we have any idea what the cost would be if we did not have this vacancy issue? Because hopefully we could resolve a lot of that, you know, working through some kinks. What would the cost of going to a two-tier system versus a three-tier, where middle and elementary school were on one tier and high school was on another? Because it seems to be in a lot of what we saw that the busing seems to really be what halts the calendar adjustants.
I think Mr. Nieder maybe has shared that previously.
I think
We would
so.
need to get that for you and see if it's updated. I'll just throw one additional caveat into that discussion. The three-tier system also allows more of our bus drivers to be employed full-time than a two-tier system would, so.
So a couple thoughts on that. One, to Ms. Caulfield's point, right now we have some routes that are already hybrid middle high school. So I don't know if you want to go two tiers, elementary, middle, or middle high school, but I know we have some middle high school now, just to keep that open as an option. I mean, I think in the next couple of years we could stand up a pilot or at least talk about what one could look like. But I mean, the feedback that we've gotten is that we know we've got strong opinions on both sides. We've got some people that really want to change. We've got some people that really don't want to change. And we have limited resources to make any sweeping changes at this point. So part of me wonders, I don't want how much time to invest in it until we're able to resolve some of these other issues. One thing that Mr. Schneidmiller had brought up from transportation that I thought was really interesting when he was talking about the buses and everything is that we're talking right now about bus driver vacancy at our current route number, but it looked to me that over the last 10 years, we've reduced our number of routes by a factor of what, in half, more than that? It's been huge. And so, we used to employ many more bus drivers, and we had several more routes.
More people wanted to be employed as bus drivers, I think, is also a part of that.
We also had a lot of those routes because we had a board who allowed school choice, which took us over $1 million a year to decrease.
Yeah, but I saw like years of that higher route number, and then it like dropped precipitously, and then it like dropped again. And I think kind of understanding all of that and why is going to be important to really knowing what resources we'll have. And then that goes back to Ms. Johnson-Hostler's questions about school assignment, and then what routes we'll need, and what the legislature does with that. So there's a lot of pieces to this that I don't think we're going to solve this anytime soon.
Thank you, Ms. Madden.
I don't know that we've established a particular direction, but I think we heard waiting and getting answers to more questions. I think we heard,
Maybe a proposal for a pilot.
yeah. But
It looks like we have lots of details from 2021. I just can't download them from David because we've been here before. So some of the questions I think are in the PowerPoints.
yeah.
Like Durham, like we look at Durham, Anne Arundel County, so there is quite a bit of history that probably can be pulled that Mr. Nieder did.
So will 2021 be a good reference, just coming out of COVID, between just schedules, academic, who was in school, virtual? I feel like there's so many variables that 2021 might not give us the best picture.
I mean, to answer the questions people had, like did we look at other districts, what came out of it? Which doesn't impact our district, just questions other people asked already. Sliding time is in here. Again, not about changes, but answering these questions. Save your sliding time.
Well, thank you guys very much. Appreciate your work on this and sharing this data.
We can pull together the presentations that have been done previously, make sure that you get them all together or know where they all are, when they all are, so you can check assembly. I do just want to reiterate that the survey data from the stakeholder groups is much more current. It's from the fall, it's from the winter, so.
This has been helpful, thank you. I think ultimately the energy and the direction from the board is this is a topic that we'd like to dig a little bit deeper into. At the same time, give ourselves the time to, if we are going to pursue something down the road in the future, that we do it the right way and strategically. So that's helpful from our standpoint.
I think we have some time to do some closed session work. So is there a motion to consider confidential personnel information protected under GS 143-318A1 and E3 to consult with the Board of Education attorney and preserve attorney-client privilege as provided in GS 143-318A3. Also, consult with the Board of Education attorney and preserve attorney-client privilege as provided in GS 143-318.11A3 due to current litigation, Wake County Board of Education versus Brightheart Family LLC, 22 CV 014-393, Wake County Superior Court, and to consider confidential student information protected under GS 115C-402 in the Family Education Rights and Privacy Act 20 USC 1232G.
So moved.
All right, we have a motion and a second to enter into closed session. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, nay? All right, thank you. We are now in closed session.